Perché non sta?
Anche io facevo
Sì, ora io
non
non
mi
capisco.
ricordo poi faccio tutta una risposta. Guardo, mi riguardo.
Ditemi voi quando...
Sì, c'è un attimo un problema.
Non problema, vedi, io per me. Insomma, già sul poi questa parte mia. Cioè,
Ok, forse ora ci siamo. Se io ci siamo. Possiamo andare.
Okay. Yeah, so hi. This is going to be a little bit different from everything else, I guess, in a variety of ways. So I want to say a couple of things before I get started. First, I know that this is not the norm in classics, but if you don't understand because I'm missing some sort of like a massive logical link between things that I say, stop me. I don't care to be interrupted. I get interrupted all the time. I talk to economists.
You'll know who she is, right?
Right. Yes, I'm hi. Do you want to?
Typically, but it's absolutely fine. We just go. Federica Carugati from King's College London, known to all of us for her path-breaking work on, yes, indeed, on how polities come together and break apart. In Antiquity and Beyond, creating a constitution, law, democracy, and growth in ancient Athens is a work of great import, not just to people who work on classical Athens.
Oh,
and
I'm really glad to hear.
Well, that's my 2 pence. Yes, but of course, I mean, this is partly because we are fellow graduates of Bologna, so
of course,
I'm bound
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I'm glad you came through.
We did. Yeah, and then of course, a doctorate from Stanford, where she also held a position, and after indeed holding posts at Indiana and Stanford, she joined KCL King's in 2020, and she's now senior lecturer in history and political economy. Her latest book is A Moral Political Economy, Past, Present, and Future, with Margaret Levy. And her paper this evening, interesting.
It depends on where you come
well,
from.
you know, yes, clearly I'm jet lagged. Governance archaeology, collective governance in global history.
All right. So sorry about getting up too early. Now I'm gonna get up. So thank you, Federica. It's wonderful to be here and to meet you and to actually have the opportunity to present this to an audience that is different from what I normally do or the people that I normally hang out with these days. But as I said, the presentation is going to be a little bit different. There's no handout, and the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is going to take us farther afield from the world of classical Greece and Rome. So if things don't make sense, and particularly because I'm speaking to debates that are not germane to the field of classics in many respects, just feel free to stop me. I will also not speak for nearly long enough because if I speak to an economist for an hour, they will never speak to me again. And so I've learned a long time ago that the most I can speak is about 20 minutes, of which I am heard for 5 or 3. And this is obviously different from like what you guys can do, which is really remarkable and amazing. Hi Phil. But again, like if this ends at like 10:15, I'm perfectly happy. But I will not be speaking for a long time. But again, this is the reason why I'm saying, like, if you want to interrupt me, please do. We've got plenty of time. There's no way I'm going to be talking for an hour here. Okay. All right. A last proviso, this is super new work. I spent about the last 2 years collecting the data that I was able, with my colleague Riley Wong at the Meta Governance Project, to sort of like begin to analyze over the summer. This is a presentation that sort of like smacks together a few of the sort of like a most obvious findings from this database. But there's nothing here that is going to be in the sort of like awarded as conclusions or sort of like a tested hypothesis and so on and so forth. So it is, keep in mind that this is very recent work. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, starting from this is total and complete BS, and you should go back to studying classical Athens. Because this doesn't make any sense. All the way to like, here is a case that you should know about, or these are things that I think about when I listen to you talk about this stuff. So please feel free to sort of jump in at any point in time. The two things that I want to say finally as premises before we get going is that I'm going to be talking certainly about sort of like a forms of, let's say, democracy that are actually better understood as collective governance. I'll define what that means in a moment. But I'm certainly thinking about sort of like a more global perspective and temporally speaking about cases that range well before and well after Athens. So this is the context that is taking us a little bit further afield from the conversations that we have had so far. So why do I care about this sort of like attempt at, and I'm going to say, Phil, this is for you, is that I'm going to try to contextualize a little bit why, where I think, particularly in giving you a sense of like the sort of like the theoretical background here, where I think that the conversation that you invited us here to sort of like engage in, what are the debates that I am familiar with that this conversation can speak to. So this is for you, and this is the slide for you, which is that I think that the conversation about forms of collective governance, forms of thinking about democracy or collective governance that are sort of like a less obviously coming out from the historical record is really relevant for a conversation about sort of like a forms of collective governance and institutions for democracy today, as we witness a fundamental surge in the demand for these spaces. And this applies in online as well as offline spaces. So you will maybe recognize some of these symbols, maybe not. Mastodon, user-controlled form of Twitter, Ethereum blockchain, decentralized blockchain project, and more in the world of sort of like offline spaces, things that you'll be more familiar with, citizen assemblies. Right? In the last 10 years, we have seen a surge in these spaces that are built by people that usually don't know what they're doing, and that are trying to increase participation. They want people to come in and they want to make decisions collectively about, let's say, climate change or euthanasia. Or they decide how the districts in California are going to be designed in order to avoid the phenomenon known as gerrymandering. So these are big deal issues in thinking about democratic governance. There's other stuff that we don't necessarily need to think about, but that I don't need to go into. But this is what I'm thinking about when I think about, like, we need to learn more about collective governance in the past, because there's a lot of demand for spaces, for these spaces today.
Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
In the terminological shift from democracy to collective governance.
Yeah.
We use like a tradition from which you take the name, or
it's very simple. It's I'll talk about this in a second, but it's essentially like any sort of like a roughly peer governance that is not dependent from a higher authority. Okay. So I'll get to that in a moment to try to explain a little bit more what this is, but this is not a fundamental, a deeply philosophical idea. Okay. It's just a space in which people come together to make decisions that are relevant for the community. Okay. So when you think about collective governance in this slide, and this is like where my economists, political scientists, and computer science colleagues are, they think about this in terms of something that is very recent and fundamentally facilitated by information and communication technology, such as the internet. But of course, as the token historian in the room, usually I show up and say that is not the case. However, when you then sort of like try to figure out, like theoretically, like where, if we think about collective governance before the 21st century, where do we look? And what we get is a very simple, basic, and fundamentally untrue story, which is collective governance was possible at small scale in bands of hunter-gatherers. It then becomes possible in the extraordinary experiences of Greece and Rome. Then it dies out, and then it shows up again in the revolutions of early modern Europe, which of course liberal democracies today in the West are the offsprings of. And so you think about this story and you're like, this is a very peculiar set of cases that tends to be associated with a very specific philosophical and ideological tradition and very much located in Europe. So is collective governance European? Of course it isn't, right? This is but it isn't in the sense that there is an enormous amount of work in various social scientific disciplines, including archaeology, anthropology, political science. Many of you will be familiar with at least some of these that suggest that in fact these experiences of collective governance are much more widespread than the simple story of Western civilization would suggest, or the approach of sort of like the average classical scholar in the sense of thinking about Greece and Rome, the Mediterranean, and so on and so forth. This work covers recorded human history and sometimes more, and it covers the whole world. But it is not systematized. We don't have a sense of what this like vast array of evidence about collective governance actually tells us about how these spaces, these institutions arise, why they just are sustained or not, and why they fail. Okay, and so this is what we're trying to do in this database. This is obviously not a slide that you're supposed to read. This is a screenshot from the database. This is just to give you a sense of what the data looks like. There are communities, there are institutions, there are the mechanisms that characterize these institutions. I'll explain all of this. We look at time, geography, size. We've got a bunch of historical information that we try to collect about these communities. So we try to look into this. Before I start boring you to death with what this database is all about and what we are learning from it, let me just give you a bit more in terms of like what we are actually trying to do with this, because I've already taken you to like, I don't know, the world of online communities. I want to sort of bring you back to show you how I'm thinking pragmatically about how this data is relevant for these broader conversations. So first, I'm working with colleagues at the Meta Governance Project, including the co-author on this paper, that are working essentially to build what they understand as a governance layer for the internet. They're trying to build the software tools that allow members of online communities to govern themselves more effectively. People on Reddit, people on social media platforms, where what essentially computer scientists and communication scholars are seeing, governance becomes very quickly confrontational, it fails, people fight, and so on and so forth. So they're trying to figure out how to build in the software the tools that the communities can use. And so the database is meant to essentially build some of the historical side of this material. So that the computer scientists don't sort of like go home at night to say like, the only tools that we have to think about democracy today come from, let's say, God forbid, the United States in the last 45 years. The idea is sort of build the historical, so the undercurrent of all of this. And we're doing stuff that is, I think, actually quite cool. We're integrating this data set with something similar that collects information about online collective governance mechanisms, and we're integrating it so that people that are trying to figure out how to like define their rules for getting things done together can create their model community, and then they can go and like see what the most close historical antecedent is. So just to sort of build some history into this conversation. So this is going to be like simply like a tool. Like I wanna try to figure out how in this room we're going to try to, I don't know, decide who makes the orders for lunch. And we have a panoply of decision-making mechanisms that we can choose from, right? This is the idea. The second, and more important for my purposes as a scholar of political economy, is to use this evidence from pre-modern history to expand essentially the theory of collective governance. So to push back against the idea that there is something fundamentally European, for example, about collective governance, or that there is something, or that the possibilities and limits of collective governance are still defined by essentially what it is that defines them now in economics and political science, which is fundamentally problematic assumptions about human behavior. So I'm going to give you an example. Economists think about humans collaborating with one another as in modeling terms as very simple actors. They are unitary actors. They are selfish. They try to maximize their preferences. You may have heard stuff like this. And these assumptions are still very much embedded in the models that we use to think about collective governance. So the idea is to sort of broaden the scope empirically of what collective governance looks like, to say something like, for example, collective governance might work at various scales as opposed to like very small scale or otherwise. So this is, again, the reasons why I'm going to stop now, because I feel like most of you are like glancing over what's going on. So I'm just going to give you a chance to like pause. The reason why we're gathering all this information is to create this toolkit so the communities can sort of broaden the scope of the tools that they use to govern themselves. And second, to think more about theory building. What is this evidence from pre-modern history telling us about the theory of collective governance? I'm going to stop for a second because like, you guys look worse than my students. I was like, what the hell is she talking about? So I'm just going to stop for a second and give you a chance to sort of collect yourselves. Questions. This should make sense. So if it doesn't, I must have missed something.
Where do you stop?
What?
How pre-modern are these communities? Where do you stop chronologically?
Where do I stop chronologically? I mean, right now, that is not a problem because we have so few, as I will talk about in a second, communities from various parts of the world, which is actually the goal there. But essentially, pre-modern is anything that happened before yesterday. We need to like figure that out in the sense that like the problem is that some communities we have only evidence. This is like a problem of like empirical data. We have only evidence from the 19th century, but the practices go back like sometimes like hundreds of years. So the chronology there is problematic because there is this gap. Right, and this is particularly ethnographic sources from sub-Saharan Africa and North America. I have like Evans Pritchard, who's like going in 1940, but this stuff dates to much earlier. So I'm still trying to sort of play with that sort of like a chronological gap in order to not like remove all this evidence that I want to have in the database. Okay, even if it's more contemporary than what most historians would think. But I'll actually explain a little bit more about the database in a second. Yes, James.
I don't want to derail where you're
Keep
going,
going.
but you're talking about to say that the current assumptions of economists about individual actors, etc. How does that is that neoclassical economics or is that new institute?
Yeah. It's a little bit of both, right? This is like again a conversation that we can have until like your eyes pop out in the sense that there's a lot of actually like particularly when it comes to like the work of the neo-institutionalists coming into classics, like I can talk about that a lot. The basic story about neo-institutionalism is that it tried to push back against neoclassical assumptions, but it didn't in many respects. And the assumptions about human behavior are sound, right? And so in the models, if you have a rational choice model, the model is still going to simplify behavior in some fundamental way. And the problem with that is not that I don't care about neoclassical or neo-institutional economics. My problem is that when it sort of like hits my issue of collective governance, what I hear from economic theory is if a bunch of people get together, they're selfish, they're maximizing their own preferences, and therefore cooperation fails. So there is like the underpinning theoretically of all of this is models of cooperation failure that are predicated on these assumptions. And so I don't care about the assumptions, but what I'm doing is like take the empirical evidence of the conversation and say, well, it doesn't look like it fails, or it doesn't look like it's impossible at scale, right? So this is what I'm trying to do. Yes, Phil.
Just a question about timeline. It's a different kind of question than like short timeline. So I'm thinking about my department. I'm thinking about how this is a place where this room actually is a location of collective governance, right? And quite frequently, in our department, it's one of the most democratic departments or committed to collective governance departments in the university.
Yeah.
And we're known for it. It's a bit of an embarrassment to the upper administration.
I understand.
So, so my question is, it seems to me that in the course of 10 years of being here, yeah, the collective governance at the micro scale
Yeah.
is shifting constantly.
Yeah.
So the collective governance style that we had 8 years ago depending on who's the strategos autocrator of the department.
Right. Yes,
So,
exactly.
princeps, yeah.
Very crucial
So
institutional moment.
when you have some kinds of strategoi, then everything is quite collective. And then, so for example, our recently departing head of department, we really pushed us to do collective work.
Yeah.
Also to take the responsibility of it. And then the previous two heads of department were like the opposite. They were total little kings who made sure that everybody, had to understand that. And so at the micro level,
Yep.
how do we imagine this is going to work? Let's say in 18th century French, whatever, cafe culture or something like that.
Yep. Well, I mean, it depends
How can
on
we track
where
it
you
data-wise?
look.
This
right?
is always my criticism of
Right.
Stanford School. How do you track these things in data? You know,
I
'cause you guys commit to
I
data,
do,
know.
but I do it with
Yeah.
tools that differ from the ones that you would use, and this
Okay.
is why we belong to different departments in some
Yeah.
respects, right?
Yeah.
And again, and I think it is fair to say that we just do different things, and
Yeah.
I need your critique in order to make sure that my stuff is as solid as it can possibly
Sure,
be.
absolutely.
But at the same time, I am asking questions that in most cases, the classical historians would not ask,
Yeah.
because we'll be overwhelmed, and so am I. Don't
Yeah,
get me wrong,
yeah.
by the extraordinary complexity of pinning this stuff down in the historical record,
Sure, thank you.
right?
Yeah.
What I do is that I make decisions, and I try to
Yeah.
make decisions that are consistent across the way in which I analyze data and in the way that I try to collect it.
Right.
That
Thank you.
it is my decision as an expert in the field, but then of course the database is public, or it will be shortly,
Yeah.
and you go in and you say, Federico, you're full of shit.
Right.
And that's great, because then it is in fact, this is, and I'm gonna talk about this at the end, it is your feedback that gets me to refine the data that I have. I'm by myself with a bunch of undergraduate students, and I've got this coverage right now.
Yeah.
We're not even close. We haven't even scratched the surface.
Yeah.
But I am starting to look into what this data is telling me and waiting for you to tell me
Cool.
this is wrong and this is wrong.
It's just a
and this is wrong.
methodological question.
Yeah. No, and
So-
it's a very crucial methodological question. Yes, Andrea.
Not a question from me, but from Roger on chat. So Roger, hi Roger. He's asking, does your
It
data
does.
include Mesopotamia?
It does. I'm working with Mesopotamian archaeologists, and the data on Mesopotamia is probably more solid than the one around classical Athens, because that one I put together. No, yes, I do. I do have. You'll see. I do have Mesopotamia. It's a big. I'm working with some people at the University of Bologna, in fact, who have been putting together a really remarkable data set of third millennium BC Mesopotamia on stuff that tracks state capacity, legal orders, the sort of evolution of all of these phenomena based on climactic shocks. It's mind-blowing. It's really great stuff. And Mesopotamia plays an enormous role in this data set alongside many other places. So yes,
I remember
yes.
reading something about, I think, Middle Assyrian merchant communities in Anatolia, and they're they have a long line of communication to the homeland, and so they're particularly sort of self-governing locally.
Yeah. We have a series. So in Mesopotamia, between the third millennium and essentially the first millennium, the array of organizations and the shifting is really mind-blowing. And so, and I have a bunch of cases in the database that cover that period and that region. So I'd love to, if you can send me a note about what you have in mind, I'll be able to tell you I got it, or I need to look into it.
I'll see if I can dig it up. It will come from a Bergen dissertation that I was an external for about 10, 12 years ago. I'll see if I can dig up the guy's name, because you'd be better off communicating with him direct.
That'd be great. That's exactly what I'm hoping to get out of these early presentations of this work. Thank you.
The other thing that I would flag up, because it's my thing, is civic subdivisions.
Yeah.
And Jones's book he kind of seems slightly surprised about how kind of organized they are, not just in Athens, but across the Greek world. And he kind of sees it as a sort of, I can't remember his phrase, but basically a way of harmlessly, taking up their energies so they don't mess up the larger community,
Yeah.
Because I think now we'd sort of see what's striking is how they seem to model themselves in exactly the same way.
Yeah. So
They behave like Polis, or maybe vice versa.
So where I see the relevance of sort of like a sub-political, perhaps, or sub-polis or sub-community dynamics is that like, so what I'm seeing right now in the data set, and again, it's sort of like a tangential to your question, and again, if you have like references, please send them along. But what I'm seeing here is that there is a lot of collective governance that goes on at various types of local levels. But again, the devil's in the details, like how those local levels are intertwined with the sort of like upper levels is really where you can begin to sort of like a flesh out whether collective governance has bite or is just a way of sort of like a, you know, telling people like, yeah, you know, you do your little thing, but I'm actually in charge of all the decisions. So again, like I think that in the database right now, I could cite cases of both. And as I will talk about at the very end, these sort of fleshing out these relationships is one of the next things that I want to do, partly because in the data collection, we're actually trying to code for links among institutions within a community. All of this is gonna, I need to sort of get into the some of the definitions here because the conversation is already taking us to a level where you need to actually know the nomenclature of the database. So I'm gonna, Roger, are you satisfied? Can I move on?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send you a piece I wrote, and that could kind of give you pointers to people who know more. That's
wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Okay, so let me just get to the nomenclature before the. I think I've got one last slide that sort of like gives you the scope of the scope of this conversation, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more in the nitty gritty about the database. I'm going to talk more in the rest of the talk about the nomenclature. So where this conversation is going. So when I'm saying like I want to, this data is contributing to a varieties of conversations. I think that one of the more important ones, and this is Phil, like maybe something that you have in mind as well, is our conversations about this, essentially the state of our democracies today. And I think it is fair to say that compared to, let's say, 1998, a feeling that something has gone wrong in democratic Western liberalism is sort of creeping up. And we see the erosion of those institutions that we thought, and some sort of famous political scientists thought or identified as the end of history, right? Liberalism seemed to have won at the end of the 20th century. Liberalism is in big trouble at the beginning of the 21st. And there is a lot, when I was back at Stanford in the between 2018 and 2020, and this is the book, The More Political Economy, that has come out a couple of years ago now. This was my world. These were the conversations that I was steeped in. And a lot of these conversations would say, oh, you know, like neoliberalism is bad, like there's lots of inequality, we don't know what to do with climate change, it's really sad. The politics captured by the elites. But there's a lot of diagnosing and very little sort of like a thinking about, well, what do we need to do in order to like shore up these institutions that have done so much for progress and development in the 20th century. Recently, very recently, in fact, some of these conversations have begun to sort of like build some theory. So where should neoliberalism or liberalism go in the 21st century? And a fundamental focus of these contributions, this is Danielle Allen, whom you will know, who just wrote a fantastic new book, sort of like laying out both the theoretical underpinning of a new form of political economy and some of the institutions that we need. And she, like my colleague Margaret Levy and Paolo Berabendi and Tim Vesely at LSE, are emphasizing a lot of what we as classicists know well, very well, but that modern democracies have forgotten for a long, long time, which is the role of participation and inclusion in the political decision-making process. And so by looking at these sort of the nitty-gritty of historical collective governance, this project is really trying to speak to the question of how we build these participatory institutions and what those institutions need in order to flourish in modern liberal representative democracies. Okay, so this is the big sort of like a payoff of where this is going. Now, what I see coming out of the database, again, this is very, this speaks to those sort of a theoretical, myopic sort of traditions that I mentioned before. So it might sort of like fly over your head a little bit. And I apologize for that. But if I look at the analysis right now, and I look at what I'm seeing coming out of this, again, initial round of both data collection and analysis, I see a few things that are sort of relevant for these conversations. One, certainly collective governance institutions are not European. They've emerged all over the world throughout history. It is difficult to find them because they don't emerge all the way up to the level where we see them in France or in England or in Greece or in Rome, where collective governance or democracy or republicanism are all sort of at the top of the decision-making institutions of the polity. But it requires some sort of methodological shift to actually try to figure out where these pockets are. And when you do that, you see, again, it's a little bit everywhere, but it also applies to communities at various scales. So this is something that economists and political scientists are particularly keen on repeating, that collective governance really only applies at a small scale. This doesn't seem to be the case. These pockets of collective governance pop up in communities that are like 100 people strong or more than 10 million strong, right? And this is the, I guess, boundary of the historical data. The third point, again, this is related to what I just said. Instead of being at the top of the political hierarchy, so collective governance is like the Athenian assembly. These collective governance outside of Europe tends to be nested within more hierarchical structures, and so you see councils and assemblies within, sort of nested within anything from other councils and assemblies all the way to empires. And so the question again is in trying to flesh out the power relations among these institutions to understand whether collective governance has bite or not, or it's just like a sort of circus for the masses. Finally, when we look across time and space about these institutions, we see enormous variation. So you say assembly, I say potato. Assemblies are fundamentally different in their configuration, essentially wherever you look. And so trying to sort of get a better understanding, or councils, or the role of secret ballot, the ways in which these institutions or these mechanisms are constructed and how they yield sort of outcomes for the stability, the resilience of collective decision making varies dramatically. And so now I'm just going to tell you about variation, but I don't have a lot of sort of conclusions to draw at this stage. So we can talk a little bit about that right now. Okay, so this is a long-winded premise to what I'm going to be actually showing you today. I'm going to be stopping for a second before I delve into these next 2 points again. But what I'm going to be doing right now is give you essentially describe the database, what the data looks like, and then I'm going to give you some of the initial sort of more specific findings that I am seeing emerging, or patterns, I should say, that I'm seeing emerging from the evidence. So there's going to be a lot of conversation about nomenclature and data now. So I'm going to stop for a second to make sure that you're still with me. You're like, I see you a little bit more hoppy and less glanced over than earlier. So that makes me happy. Yes, please.
Yes. No, the first one is just to make sure I understand.
Yes.
Is the main criteria for your definition of collective governance bones that it is like people meeting on a space which can be either real or metaphorical?
Oh, it's very real. It's in this, forget Mastodon. This is very real.
Okay.
And also Mastodon is not metaphorical at all. Right? These are real people coming in and making decisions.
I imagine that metaphorical is more something we can maybe see after we enter the modern era, totally modern. Yeah, imagine.
I'm missing the connection here.
No, nothing.
No. Keep going. You got something.
Yeah, no, it's because if we imagine the pre-modern era, a prerequisite I imagine would be that people had to meet and see each other.
Yeah. They definitely do.
The metaphorical thing I was thinking maybe even before the internet, maybe the newspaper, the journal, as a metaphorical space where to have a debate.
Got it. The public. Okay.
So maybe a virtual space, rather than a metaphorical space.
No, these are obviously they're not virtual in any sort of understanding of that word. These are very much spaces where people come together. And in fact, I'm going to define right now what collective governance is, and you'll tell me if this clarifies what I'm talking about.
Thanks.
We're ready to go.
Okay. So, 2 years of data collection, 66 communities, which gives you a sense of like the pain and suffering of my life since I moved to England for a variety of reasons that have nothing to do with the British. The communities come to the database. This, of course, is 66. We must have looked at like thousands, but by no means we have looked like wide enough. 66 communities, they enter the database if we have reasonably sort of like a robust information about at least one collective governance institution, a CGI. Okay, a collective governance institution, Stefano, this is for you, is a structure in which a group of more than one person gathers to make a decision on behalf of a community. The participants, and this is from David Savage's book on the rise and fall of democracy that some of you may have encountered. He distinguishes early democracy and early autocracies based on whether the decision-making institution is independent of a higher authority. This is also what I do, like drawing his distinction clearly. So the database is communities that have at least one of these institutions, where people, roughly peers, make decisions in common on behalf of the community, and they're independent. So they're not a bureaucracy. They're not a dependent group that responds to a ruler of whatever kind. The obvious distinction here is early modern Europe versus early modern China. So just go along with your intuition if that's what comes up. But this is the idea. It's not bureaucrats that are handpicked from the sovereign. This is independent decision makers. We have so far coded over 300. So each community has at least one CGI, but it could have like many, and it can also have institutions that are not institutions for collective governance. And we are coding decision-making and enforcement institutions. We're not coding everything that's going on in these communities, right? We're coding places or institutions or structures where people come together to make decisions and where people come together to punish, to enforce those decisions, okay? There are collective governance institutions, there are no collective governance institutions. We code all of that, and we also try to code the links between these institutions. There's a king, the king is selecting, now I don't even know, but like the idea here, that I just don't want to make this too complicated right now, but the idea here is that we try to figure out like, is the relationship between, let's say, the council and the court. How are these institutions talking to each other? Are they talking to the king? Of course, if the king is handpicking all of these people, the case does not enter into the database. If instead these institutions are independent, then it goes in and we try to code how they relate to one another in terms of like these mechanisms. And this is where the rubber really hits the road in terms of like what I'm interested in. Within each institution, there are mechanisms. And these are the sort of like a micro level structures that allow the institution to work. So it's a council. Let's say people are selected because they are rich or they are old or they are something. And within that decision-making institution, they make decisions by show of hands or by secret ballot, and they debate, they deliberate, they don't deliberate. Like I'm trying to code all of this within the institutions, how things work in practice. And to make this mass of information reasonably accessible, not just by my brain, but by others as well, we code these institutions into three main categories. These mechanisms into three categories. Mechanisms that define access to the institution, mechanisms that regulate decision-making, and mechanisms that regulate enforcement. Okay? So what does this look like? These are the communities by region. We've got, as you can see here more easily, a bunch of communities in Europe. This is probably never going to go away. We just have much better data about Europe, much more easily sort of like retrievable. And so hopefully this will all go up, but my suspicion is that this sort of like a prevalence of European communities will not go away. My problem right now is this, that I've got so little about a good chunk of the world. But again, like I'm not presenting results that suggest like any sort of like a frequency here. So in some respects, this is like a diagnostic test to tell me like, I need to talk to people in South America and Oceania because I need information from that. In fact, my information about Oceania comes from James Kierstead, which gives you a sense of like more work. Okay, so communities by size, we see clustering around this sort of a middle size of 10,000 to 100,000 members. but we've got like sizes of sort of like other communities of other sizes as well. Temporally speaking, something fundamentally obvious comes out of this. There's a clustering in the first millennium BC, a clustering in the second millennium AD. These are sort of like anyone who studied classics and European history will sort of like intuitively say, yeah, of course. I'm not quite sure if this is just because the European evidence is driving the results, or this is in fact something that has to do with like some sort of like a temporal, connection with institutions for collective governance that tend to cluster in this millennium. I don't know right now, but this is what we see from the data right now. I suspect that this is all about the European data driving the. Wait a second before your eyes glance over. This is the European data driving the results, but something to look into as we increase the data collection. Not supposed to read this. This is just to give you a sense of all the mechanisms that apply to CGI institutions. For your ease, I broke them up into the categories to give you just a sense of what comes up, really, like from this evidence. You don't care, but I'm going to show you anyways. We see some of the usual suspects. Elections, lottery, meritocracy, age boundaries seem to be driving a lot of what we see in these in mechanisms for access. When we look at decision making, we have the councils and assemblies are extremely popular as institutions for collective decision making, but we see also other types of decision-making mechanisms that play an enormous role. People meet frequently, they often deliberate, they try to often reach consensus, and they use some form of representation, right? This is the other thing that I'm obsessed with is political scientists often distinguish pre-modern and modern democracy as participatory representative. And of course, as anyone who's ever studied ancient Athens knows, the representation is always a fundamental aspect of whatever participation you're thinking about, because you just can't have everyone. And so the rules that are regulating that representation are much more interesting than, say, Athens was participatory, which means nothing. Okay. I'm going to see the time. Okay, so
It can wait.
Okay. Do you have a question?
Yes, but it can wait.
Okay. So let me just describe the database and then we can stop for a moment. Again, when it comes to enforcement mechanisms, courts play a huge role, but then we see other like cool stuff. Again, like I have a sense that this might come out a lot of the evidence from Europe, but again, these are sort of like hunches, and I'm not quite sure. But these are sort of like a more not prominent, but the more frequent mechanisms that we see associated with enforcement practices from the database. Let me stop for a second. This was just to give you an overview of what this database is trying to code and how it comes out from this initial analysis, which is, again, like as I said, in part diagnostic.
Yes.
There you go.
Thank you. Well, several questions, but meritocracy.
Meritocracy, yeah.
How do you define it?
Super cool. Okay, well, that's
no in that
right,
in that particular
right. Context. Well, I mean, again, I don't define anything. I look at sources and I follow the sources when they tell me there's a meritocratic element here. Where the rubber hits the road is where people use words that are similar but different. And so that, again, is like where I come in and say, you call it meritocracy, I call it potato, this is really a meritocratic system. And so I try to code it. Often in the database, my RAs lost their mind over that, there is a column that's called notes, and that's usually like a book length for each community version of like my attempt at tracking those decisions. So meritocracy, which by the way, is very interestingly linked in many of these communities with heredity. Super, super interesting. So there's always a dual standard, like a double standard that operates at the same time in making decisions. So there's a hereditary line, but the hereditary line is often subject to a meritocratic element, right? So we see that coming out. Insofar as like how I define it, again, like I don't. It is just like I follow the sources, and then it is my role as a historian to think about the sources in a variety of ways that I think I'm going to address. There's a whole thing about the ethics of doing this work that has to do with both like the sort of like analytical power of these categories, but also with the fact that we are looking at non-European traditions from which we don't know much, traditions that are often given to us by colonizers or people that have, or ethnographers in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa in the 20th century that didn't necessarily have a clear grasp of some of these practices. So we try to do a lot of work in trying to translate and systematize this information in a way that takes into account all of these potential biases. Yeah. Okay, and there I've got an article in Daedalus that addresses some of these methodological choices. Andrea.
I think that there is Phil. Then we have also James online.
Hi, James.
So just a quick question about the identification of the object of your data.
Yeah.
So are we identifying it at the level of the nation state?
Yeah.
Call it?
No.
Or is it at the level of the we call a local civic community? So
yeah.
I think it's something like
I actually like that.
So you might think about the city council or something like that. But then there are other kinds of instantiations. I'm thinking of something like, where's Gazis? The Freemasons?
Yes.
Right? So secret societies.
Yes.
I'm thinking about that is to say, I think part of the problem has to do with what you mean by governance. Because I can self-govern. We could have self-govern in any room in this house, and in this building. I suspect any society in the world can do that at levels which you may say are smaller, at least smaller size. But there's a big difference between the collective governance that happens in a city council where the application leads to law giving versus a Freemason where it's not clear what.
I actually have no. This is a great question. This has been something partly because, and again, this is like my intellectual and academic path has led me to, in fact, encounter these kind of communities. Law and economics literature is full of these communities: diamond dealers, gold diggers, Freemasons, and it's like everyone under the sun who's self-governing, right? And but the problem with that literature. And I'm going to answer your question.
I know nothing
in a second.
This is just my instinct.
But I do, and I hate it. I don't actually. It's great, but the problem is that these are often very small communities, very sort of like a homogeneous communities, very communities that are like doing one thing, right? They're trying to like sort of, they're almost interest groups. The Freemasons certainly are, and a lot of the stuff in the law and economics literature also does. These are communities that are sort of like they're using these peculiar experience of self-governance to say something about essentially sort of a proto-libertarian ways of answering the question, what should we do about the erosion of democracy today? So I try to take the lessons from there while keeping the focus on something that actually goes, and I need to figure out a way to explain this much better, because right now I feel that it's more hunchy than it should be, the civic unit. Right, I have the Freemasons as the gold diggers and diamond dealers in the database in a sort of like a second sheet, but this is not what's going on into this analysis. What you see right now, those 66, I've got 25 more from the Freemason kind of stuff. But right now, this is not it. How you define a civic community is really not obvious, and I think that in some respects, like I just need to do a little bit more aggregative work from the data that I have. That is going to help me explain a little bit more what a civic community actually looks like. But if you have an intuition about a civic community, I feel that it's my intuition about a civic community. And for right now, it excludes these types of sort of a more interest groupy version. This is like lawmaking. This is decision making for sort of a welfare like function. Thank you.
This is a very basic question. I just want to make sure I understood it. So you started by saying that your data set kind of pushes back against the old assumption that collective governments works best at the local level. So about the question of scale here. So when you talk about scale, you're talking about the scale of the CGI, right? Not the scale of the host.
I'm talking right now. I'm talking about the scale of the community. The scale of CGI is often very difficult to draw
Yeah,
from.
so
the
I'm thinking,
record.
if you have like a council
Yeah,
in ancient China,
yeah,
well, that's a huge community.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But you could say like the collective government is pretty local.
yeah,
Because there's like
absolutely,
20
absolutely.
aristocrats.
Absolutely, but that doesn't, so in some respect, this is the collective governance institution emerges within the community that is the community, right? And so the degree to which the local governing arm is catering to a subset of this community, this is something that I'm trying to get at by looking at because it's data that I don't have often from the record. It's data, it's a question that I'm trying to get at by linking the institutions within the community. So I get essentially a network image of how this entire community worked. And I know the collective governance operated in one space, but that doesn't mean, and of course, I'm not claiming that collective governance operated at the level of the community, but it operated within the community. And I think that, again, if we go, this is the methodological shift that is required in order to do this work. If I only look at the sort of if I equate the size of the CGI with the size of the community, then I'm only looking at early modern Europe, right? And so this shift is required in order to get at all the other evidence that I'm trying to get. Ms. James?
Hi there.
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me? Hi there.
James,
So
yeah.
I'm really excited about the project. I think it's a great thing to do. Obviously, there's lots to think about, but that's the case with any project like this. So can you just go back to or state your the definition again? Was it something like collective governments they govern themselves without a higher authority?
Yeah, it's here.
For a separate authority or an outside authority? Okay, participants must be independent from a higher authority if it exists. So I guess my question is about I think you're going to have some mixed cases, which maybe you've come across already. I've seen references to things like gerontocracy.
Yeah.
And what I mean is there seem to be some cases where there's clearly some form of collective governance going on. You know, there are people coming together and they're discussing things, and maybe they're moving towards what they call consensus, or maybe they're voting. But nonetheless, in those situations, there can be a hierarchy that exists. It's a hierarchy that exists in the background society, but that is then imported into an assembly or council, and it may actually kind of reach its purest form. That authority kind of exercises itself. That hierarchy exercises itself in the context of the council. So I'm thinking of like some of the things in Scandinavia are like this, like the Icelandic Althing.
Yep.
With the Godin, the nobles, and also the paper I sent you, which I'm glad that you mentioned, by the way, about the Pacific. So they meet in these Malay or Marai.
Yeah, you'll see that way. That it's a one data point, but it plays a big role. It's coming up.
Well, okay, that's interesting because that I'm not sort of picking out the Pacific because I think this is probably something that you'll see elsewhere as well, or that you already have. But and Samo is probably the most obvious case. There's a class of nobles, and they have their specialist orators, and they're allowed to speak in the councils, and other people.
Yes. But this is, James, this is exactly the point of looking. So, if you go to Samoa and you code it as an assembly space, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. This is like a case of an elite. It's what comes into the database as an elite assembly. Right, so it's already coded as different, but what the mechanisms are doing here is that they're actually allowing me to trace all of these power relations. So if you have a council in which a king is selecting or handpicking, again, in some cases, this doesn't even make it into the database because the collective governance is like, in order to come in, needs to have some sort of like an independence, like it needs to exist as its own thing. But within each council or assembly or whatever, different mechanisms give you a different sense of what that collective governance, sort of like how collective governance operated in a particular case. And in some spaces, this is Mesopotamia as much as Samoa and other places in North America, these are all like, forms of collective governance that are closer to what you would imagine or described yesterday as aristocratic republicanism of some sort. And then you've got all the way to sort of like a much more sort of like a powerful forms of collective decision-making, sometimes even in the absence of any form of council or assembly structure. This, of course, often requires relatively small scales, but we see that popping up in sub-Saharan Africa as much as in North America. So again, like it's in the mechanisms that the devil lies. But I'm trying to code all of this because I don't expect that collective governance will look similarly across all these cases. And what I'm actually trying to do is trace this variation and connect it with a variety of things, as I'm going to try to do now in the analysis, including space, geography, time, size, and so on and so forth. So can we actually see or draw patterns about, the size or location of Samoa's like elite assemblies? I don't know, but this is where this database is going.
Great. Okay. It sounds like you're thinking about that. So perfect.
Okay, good. Let's get there because I think it's gonna. Consuelo.
Yeah, there's just one thing. I'm not sure if you already talked about this. It's very much close to what Phil was saying. What do you do with terrorist groups?
I don't do anything. I don't do anything. I ignore them. Yeah. What do you mean? Sorry, that we should probably. I should probably follow them.
I think of course, it's not like the same thing as you were talking about clearly, but there are groups that are gathering and kind of making some sort of decisions, which are very
No,
bad
this is
decisions,
like the ISIS.
no.
No. But I mean, this is not about like how good decisions are. This is about precisely like getting at this type of like. So in the modern world, they are called like non-state organizations, where of course like you assume already this differentiation. I don't have that distinction because in most cases, we don't have states to begin with, which that's a big hang up for political science. Doesn't matter. But like if so one of my colleagues works on legal systems in among terrorist groups, understood as non-state organizations, and she's essentially tracing the creation of perfectly stable law and courts in that are parallel to the state, and they operate within the terrorist organization. This happens all the time. ISIS is one case, but there's like lots more guerrilla groups anywhere from South America to some Southeast Asia. So this is, I mean, if this stuff came up in the historical record, it would definitely make it because these are like, essentially these are communities. They would come in as communities, but I've not encountered anything like that right now.
Sorry, on a very loosely related note, are you including religious organizations of any kind?
I just got like, like a very long email about like monasteries.
I mean,
yes, actually I probably should. Like I'm not there yet. I'm thinking about this as sort of like a civic spaces where you've got this sort of like there's no, but I don't think that that's necessarily the way that this database is going to look. Like what I'm doing right now is gathering this data. Now the database is going to be public and you're going to come and you're going to fill out a form and say, Federica, you need to add X, Y, and Z. And this is how this database is going to grow in a way that will make it possible for me to say anything. Without me being on the hook for this for the next 25 years of my life, right? So this is all great, and I want more because in some respects there's going to be like the work that I've done so far is the work of like absorbing this enormous amount of information and then trying to categorize. You can say your categories are wrong, and then we can have a conversation, or you can say this is a new case that needs to be there for this and this reason.
I've been thinking about the conclave very briefly.
Yeah.
Because there, of course, you've got, I suppose, people that have been put there by the Pope. Yeah. Cardinals are appointed by the Pope. So I suppose they're not the independent actors that we identify. But of course, it is the conclave, I suppose, that ensures the continuity of the institution.
Yeah.
Without a conclave.
So if they're put there by a pope and they're directly, so everything that they do is sort of like a dependent on. Right. In that case, it would not actually make
conclave. I mean, that guy.
But if it was, so the hunch right now is that the religious institution will look more like the kind of like special interest cases that Phil was talking about right now. But again, I might be wrong and I probably need to know more about this. But if the conclave is essentially a bureaucracy of the Pope, then it doesn't make it into the database entirely.
No.
Right. But I need to, this is something that I need to look into.
Pope is not around.
Emiliano, you had a...
Not in the room anymore.
Yeah.
I would I don't know, the cows, like side cows,
Yeah.
head cow. Those
Yeah,
are
no.
self-organizing
This is already a lot of stuff, and I need to be able to like draw some. And again, like this is meant to inform. This is not actually a good justification because like you could draw like important and valuable insights from collective governance. Essentially, this is my take now from wherever it has emerged. But I think that my claim that this work is useful for, let's say, policymakers or like community members trying to like build citizen assemblies or whatever, civil society activists, will be slightly more robust, the claim, if I look at essentially political civic units, at least right now. And then the question is like, well, maybe there is going to be a sort of like a satellite database that is all about religious groups and it's integrated within the database. But right now we're far from that level of sophistication and specification.
Yes, I mean, just to follow up on this, it strikes me that even the word civic is problematic because then we have questions about how inclusion is so how did one get included into this?
But I have something to say about that. I have something to say about that.
One suggestion is to limit your, for the database, do everything, do religious groups, do whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, the sky's the limit, yeah?
Yeah.
But for the transformation
but my
of it
life
and,
is,
and the analysis of it.
my life's the limit.
Exactly. And for the sort of the stuff that will come out of it, including preparing things for policymakers, et cetera, because this is where it matters, right? Is actually going to policy with this stuff. Make it so that have it focus on the Aristotelian end, right? If in the end, if what happens.
That's not the line that I'm going to use with them, but please keep going.
Look, the idea is something like this. Look, if the collective governance action leads to some kind of law or some kind of a legally inscribed result,
yeah,
you can limit with that. Does that make sense? Then it doesn't matter what the diamond guys are doing or what the do you see what I'm saying? Because they're not actually creating laws or things that have some kind of basis in law. At some basic, I mean, you could have a looser or a stricter interpretation of this, because that way you're focusing on things that will support the continued production or the continued appeal to civic governance instruments within government. So like it's happening in France right now.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's the idea is something like that. I mean, that might be a little bit too limiting for your interests, but otherwise we could talk about our department, and we could talk about the cult, and we could talk about any group of people that gets together.
So the reason why I am worried about saying something like inscribe the law is the product is that inscribe the law is something that is very European, and so in some respect, like I always end up like hitting my head against the fact that the categories that I create as a very European scholar who is trained as a classical historian, to boot, will end up favoring one way of thinking about the product of civil or civic engagement than others. If I think about inscribe the law in the context of sub-Saharan African or North American indigenous communities, they're going to poop in my face.
And you fall back on the loosey-goosey concept of nomos, which is not necessarily inscribed law, but sometimes it just means an accepted custom that has been collectively agreed upon.
And then how do you track that in the historical record?
So the other thing I was thinking about was where does the affect? So in one way that the collective governance is, in a civic sense, is most effective if the consequence of decision making goes beyond the group. This is a crucial point too. So that way you don't have to worry about secret societies, whatever, and go beyond the group. Yeah, but in a way you don't have a proper collective government, politically collective government structure if the consequences of the decisions do not go beyond that group.
I need to think about this.
But it's like, I mean, it's really
the Freemasons certainly went beyond the group. The gold miners didn't. So I think that you're taking me somewhere, but not all the way there. Which is, this is like arguably like fair enough.
Thinking about it for about an hour.
Yeah, no, exactly.
There's more to think about.
Keep at it. Anyways, let me just try to finish this up with just an overview of the patterns, and then some sort of like a comments about the work that I'm trying to do, that I'm going to do afterwards. So this is again incomprehensible stuff, but this is what the data looks like if a data scientist takes a database and does some sort of like the sorcery on it, which I understand better than this, but not much better than this. What this tells us are some patterns that emerge when you intersect the location of the communities, time of the community, and size of the community. Time, region, and size, just to be clear. And what we see here, which is besides some sort of like a basic information, for example, the oldest communities are in Europe and Middle East, or the smallest communities in this database are in North America. This is sort of like, again, diagnostic stuff. What is interesting here that's coming out is here, which suggests an inverted U-shape relationship between size and duration of the community. So this means that communities that last longer peak at a certain size and then go back. Is this a real finding? We don't really know, but this is something very interesting because, again, I'm a political scientist and I talk to political scientists who are obsessed with scale, and this suggests that scale is actually a sort of like is in the eyes of the beholder, right? In some respects, like it doesn't mean that, you know, small is good, big is bad. There seems to be like a more complex relationship here going on. So this is something to look into. We've tried to take out the European cases to see if the results are robust, and some of this is, but again, I'm not going to go into this in details, mostly because we're running out of time. When we interact collective governance, the list of collective governance institutions that I showed you earlier with the region, we see something actually very interesting here. There is a cluster of mechanisms that are European. These happen in Europe. Like you've got things like here, I have a magistrate acclamation, lottery, term limits, rotation. This, which you will all be very familiar with, this stuff is very peculiar to, or very specific to Europe, but it really doesn't occur in other places in the world. Again, there is a problem here because the European data is much more robust than data elsewhere, but this is something that to me was actually really interesting. There seems to be a configuration of collective governance that differs between Europe and other places in the world.
What are any examples of these?
I'm giving you this James. Wake up if you're falling asleep. If you look at essentially like big decision-making institutions, so councils and assemblies. Central council and assemblies in Europe and in Africa. This is the non-EU. Oh yeah, because they are there. So take my word for it. There will be a column here that I hidden that it's Europe, and central council and assemblies are big in Europe, but they're also big in Africa, which is very interesting. China hates big assemblies. It turns out North America has a love for local councils. Central America has got, where is it? I don't remember. And Oceania is really big on lead assembly. So we actually see, even when you sort of like disaggregate some of this data, that this big result seems to sort of like work out when we at least look at this sort of like a big sort of top ticket items, which is the ways in which collective governance essentially occurs. This is assemblies, this is councils, what do they look like? And so there seems to be some significant variation across the world in terms of the space for collective governance. Much more needs to be done on all sorts of other mechanisms. Size, there is some clustering of a number of very interesting mechanisms at these sort of like a middling sizes, 10,000 to 100,000 and 100,000 to 1 million. There is some correlation with, again, central councils and central assemblies. Europe is driving a lot of these results. What is really peculiar here is that at bigger sizes, we have very little correlation that seems to matter. You would expect that bigger communities would need more institutions. We don't see that here. We don't know if this is like just data bias or like a result of some sort. We need more data to figure that out.
Plato says you need 5,040 families for your ideal state.
Yes, yes, exactly.
No more and no less.
Another interesting thing is collective governance institutions and time. We look at, essentially like how old this stuff is and how long it seems to last. Council and assemblies are really old and last a lot. This again is driven in part by what I showed you earlier, where local councils, they're like here, really sad here, are mostly in North America. So there's this like strange finding where local councils that we actually associate with like governance in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and in other places that are closer to us as scholars of ancient Greece and Rome. Local councils are both very new and located in North America. They tend to last very little, whereas central councils and assemblies tend to be very old and to last quite a long time. Again, you know, how much of that is real, how much of that is driven by the evidence that we now have is problematic. But, you know, again, I didn't promise like any sort of like a final word on collective governance across time in global history. But certainly we have some sense from this initial data collection and analysis that there's something interesting that's going on here. There are patterns connecting the size of these communities and their duration. I told you about the inverted U shape earlier. There are interesting patterns about the mechanisms for collective governance in Europe and in other places. And something else that seems to be interesting about the relationship between the mechanisms and the size, like how does this work in terms of big or small? But there's loads more. We are going to do a series of things in the next 3 months. Well, I still have money to pay for Riley's work. And we're going to do a cluster analysis that's going to try to sort of like give us a sense of what similar communities look. Communities that are similar across, ideally, time and space and size. We're going to do a network analysis. This is something that I talked about before. This is within community to try to understand the relationship among institutions. And then I really want to get a sense of how the mechanisms in, let's say, assemblies or councils, what the variation there is. So that there are assemblies in some places that use secret ballot and whatever else. There are assemblies that use completely different mechanisms. I want to get a sense of what the patterns are within sort of like these common forms of decision-making structure. Inclusion. We're trying to look at heterogeneity. We're trying to look at how many people get in, whose interests are represented in these collective governance institutions, and if they're not represented in collective governance institutions, where, if anything, they are within the community. This is work that's going to take probably, we try to do it sort of like across cases. It takes forever. We're probably going to try to look at on a case by case, sort of a small and comparative approach. But we're trying to get a sense of, you know, again, like you get inclusion by looking at access, the mechanisms, but you also get inclusion by looking at like the level of heterogeneity within the community. So you've got like cleavages that are like social, economic, political, gender, whatever it is. How many of these cleavages are represented in the configuration of the community as a whole? We're trying to look into that a little bit. This is actually for another place. So let's just close. I don't think I have a lot of time left. So I'm just going to stop here and try to maximize feedback. What's interesting, if anything, what you'd like for us to do. And again, this is like a question that I often ask in other contexts, but it is sort of like it's a question that is very important, which is like, how do we package this information for users? And Riley is going to do. Okay, let me talk a little bit about this. So what's going to happen now is that we have, we're going to stop having the data collection run by me and a bunch of undergraduates at King's. We're going to partner with institutions in the areas where we want the information. We assume, this is the hypothesis, that the on the one hand, we sort of like we are going to have to trade off my brain that does the categorization as a unique brain versus the ability to actually do the translational work on what is meritocracy more easily from people that know the communities and the practices much more closely than we do. But what we're going to be doing now is to try to expand the data collection by partnering with institutions in other parts of the world. There's a big UKRI grant that's coming up in November that we're going to apply to, and then we're going to do like the analysis work that I mentioned. The thing about the sort of ethics of this work that I mentioned briefly, this is the last thing that I'm going to say. This is an article that my co-author and my real co-author. This is work that is actually done. I should say this with a professor of communications at the University of Boulder, Colorado Boulder, Nathan Schneider. We have been really thinking about what it means to extract this data from practices and parts of the world that we are not familiar with, particularly again when the information comes through us, through the eyes of like colonizing, sort of asymmetric power relations, and so on and so forth. And so we've been trying to think like really hard about how this data comes to us and what we do with it once we try to sort of like smack it in as data, as opposed to like, you know, traditional cultural practices that sort of regulated the lives of communities in the past.
Well, thank you so much. We have a good 15 minutes to discuss them. Can I just take advantage of my position and ask you a parochial question?
Yes, please.
So as I'm trying to think about the implications of this project in Roman history, I try and look at different levels of collective decision making. So, well, you got Rome, where you got the Comitia, and even under the so-called empire, the Principate. Principal decisions really are made by the Roman people. There is terminologically some continuity. Still the Respublica. So you have that. Then you've got hundreds of self-governing communities. Hundreds. Then you've got provincial assemblies. You've got communities that are part of the same province and that come together. And of course, yes, they come together because there is a Roman province to speak of, but they do so on their own terms. And again, they make decisions. And then you have decision-making levels within the city, which are quite important, which are the collegia. Which can be professional associations, can be religious associations. So potentially, if you look even not that hard at the Roman context, you've got loads of examples that are going to skew your evidentiary basis. And I suppose there's a small question here. Now, of course, if you look at the geography of the empire, then you've got plenty of cities in what we now call Europe, plenty of cities in North Africa, and plenty of cities in Asia Minor, Syria, and so on. And you know, would I don't know, Tarraco, Lambaesis, and Apollonia fall under different continents?
This is great. These are all great questions. The one thing that I'm going to start with is that Rome is not unique by any stretch of the imagination. You see that in India, you see that in Egypt, you see that in Mesopotamia. So there's sort of like a dizzying array of structures from the very top to the very bottom is something that is not peculiar to Rome. At some point in trying to sort of like delve deeply into the cases that I knew best, that cover anything from any European evidence from classical Athens all the way to, let's say, early modern European states, I realized that if I kept on distinguishing Tarragon from Florence, I would like die. And most importantly, my database would fundamentally be skewed by what it is that I'm trying to do against it, which is to push against this extraordinary level of specificity that we get from the European evidence, particularly the European evidence of particular eras and particular configurations of power dynamics. So at some point I stopped. Right, and I stopped with. I was talking earlier last night with Stefano about the Celts and the European communes and the Germans and so on and so forth. And at some point, I realized I already have like a third of this database that covers European history from essentially the 4th century BC onward. And if I continue to split the hair here, I am never gonna be able to like look at anything else. So this is not, the questions that you ask are all good questions. What I do again is I make decisions about when the community comes in. And at that point, I try to understand, and this is something that's going on in the database, is this an instantiation of a broader set of configurations? This is the direct answer to your question. Or is this a unique configuration in the context of something fundamentally different? You're going to die when I say this, but the Greek polis are coded in the database as democracies or oligarchies. right? There is going to be an entry now that James and Ben have provided me with the sufficient evidence to understand Hellenistic democracies as something fundamentally different. There's going to be an entry on Hellenistic democracies, but there is not going to be an entry on Athens versus Iassos versus whatever. Because I am trying to, again, push back against the dizzying array of information that we have from Europe, against the fact that I have James's paper on Samoan elite assemblies, right? So I'm trying to make, and again, I think that this actually makes a lot of sense, because what I'm trying to do is like understand broad configurations. At the end of the day, if the variation in 302 of Athens council is, like changing a rule, it matters less to me for this kind of like a sort of like a quantitative and more sort of like a bird's eye view on institutions than it does, of course, if you study Hellenistic Greek history, right? And so I choose my battles, and I look at the dizzying array of variation that I can get if I'm a specialist in an area. I am a specialist in an area, but I am trying to take a very different perspective here. And so the question is, am I able to justify the choices in a way that makes my work reasonably sort of like a robust? That's my bar. It's not to distinguish Tarragon from the neighbors.
Yeah.
But great. These are things that I'm really glad you're asking these questions, because as you can imagine, for many, many months, I thought that this was like total crap, because I had to make these distinctions and these choices. And I am not as sure about some of the choices that I've made. But again, I think that the strategy here is to like make sure that those choices showed up, as opposed to like dying when I hear Tarragon. My heart is like, I don't know. Yes,
James.
I suspect you want to get beyond these questions of eligibility and criteria, so I'm happy for the answer to be brief, but the criteria about needing to be acting independently at the higher authority, can you just gloss that a little bit? So, you're now going to include the Hellenistic democracies.
Yeah.
Is that because James has shown that in those 3 periods, they are kind of, to all intents and purposes, acting independently of Hellenistic monarchs?
Yeah.
In the Roman example, for example, would all of those thousands of imperial cases filtering down be ineligible anyway because they're acting under an imperial system?
I don't think it's just about the imperial system, right? It is really about the nitty-gritty of how those decisions are made. Like, if the local councils and gatherings or whatever make decisions independently, like de facto, and I have got boundary cases in the database that are helping me think a little bit about where I draw this line, because once again, I draw this line, right? And it's not obvious, but I've got a few cases that are boundary cases where either from the evidence, I am not so sure how to make a decision. Like, is this really independent, or is this really like, there is a fundamental, let's say, ideological and or structural influence of the monarch here that I suspect but can't really see from the evidentiary record. And here, like the database, the case stays as a boundary case. In the context of these areas, like I would actually have to look into those very carefully. And but in the context of the Hellenistic stuff, as far as I can tell from these 2 presentations, which is essentially how much I know about Hellenistic history, the garrison doesn't matter to me, right? In some respects, as long as the garrison is not coming into the assembly armed and supervising what is being said. If the garrison is coming into the assembly armed and supervising what is being said, then Hellenistic democracies don't make it into the database. That might be a sort of like a rough, a yardstick, but this is my yardstick. And as you can imagine, I've got lots of other fish to fry in other places of the world where, in the end of the day, if Hellenistic democracies don't make it into the database, no one will die. Sorry, James. Sorry, Ben.
Thank you for the thought. I was thinking, do you think that the data that you collected on the CGI can tell us something on the growth or failure of the societies.
Yeah.
Because what popped into my mind was that this book a few years ago by Robinson and Acemoglu on the why.
This is why I do this work. This is why I wake up every morning. Yeah.
and they attribute the failure to the societies to the lack of a very strong democratic power.
Yeah.
But then I remember that they received some critics because they didn't take into account the fact that there were actually other groups that could have played a role.
Okay. I can talk about this forever. So Acemoglu and Robinson are the people that made the study of ancient political structures palatable to political economists. And this is something that I will forever be grateful for, because without them, I will never be able to stand here or anywhere really to talk about this stuff, because no one would give me any money to do so. So that is great. What's that?
What was the book called? Sorry. The book that they wrote, what was it called?
They wrote one very famous book that's called Why Nations Fail, and then more recently another one that's called The Narrow Corridor. I would hardly recommend these books to anyone who studied history at any point in time during their lives. But they are fundamental pioneer and influential figures in what is now the discipline that I call historical political economy. Without them, this discipline would not exist. This is an incredibly vibrant field. All of you who have an interest in history should know about this. I've got loads of information to share with you if you are interested. They don't. This discipline was born with Acemoglu and Robinson, who take, let's say, an impressionistic approach to the historical evidence. And what historical political economists are trying to do now is to actually shore up the history. But these are quantitative political economists. These are people that run regressions, and they do difference in different. They do they apply all of these statistical methods that are increasingly aimed at identifying causal relations among phenomena. This is a very narrow view of what we can do with history. And so the idea is to sort of bring the experience of real historians who are they understand context as context, not as just more data, to speak to these people. And so what Acemoglu and Robinson say in some respects is don't ever believe that, because they are why I do what I do. They think that America, not just Europe, but America, is the end of history. And they are trying to show you why America, and this is something that's very common in economic history and in political economy, they're trying to show you why America is America now, as opposed to South America, as opposed to Southeast Asia or China, and so on and so forth. So the evidence that they look at, again, this is mostly European evidence. If you look at their books, there's a bunch of European states that are, the sort of a shackled or happy or whatever. And then there's everyone else who's either failed or it's a Leviathan. And it's this captures a bunch of history. It does. There's no way that story is wrong, right? The West is, or as Ian Morris puts it, still for a little bit rules. But then the question, as the West will not rule anymore, is really to understand what's going on in the rest of the world that can tell us a little bit more about how collective governance works, how states emerge, and so on and so forth. So again, super winded answer to your question, but don't believe most of what you read, particularly in the public-facing books that they write. Look at their papers if you're interested in that, and more importantly, read more in this historical political economy field that is going to give you a much better sense of questions of collective governance, of democracy through time, that will just give you more information that is real.
So do you think that actually the data on CTI can tell you something?
Yeah, but this is such a low-hanging fruit, right? Because the stuff that they do is this impressionistic, let me tell you about world history in 200 pages and I've got 3 data points. And so it's easy to say you guys are wrong, but if you say you guys are wrong, then you're missing the point, because what they're doing is much more important than that. And yes, this work, which, like the broader tradition in historical political economy done now, is looking seriously at non-European data. So insofar as that is the main takeaway, I think that this work, like many others done by historical political economists, can help us understand how these institutions arise and fail in a way that is not already predestined by the idea that there is a telos, which is like modern liberal democracy and everything else is sort of like, you have to explain why that failed, which is not a methodologically robust.
Yeah. We got time, I think, for one final question, whether from the room or from the third one.
I stunned you all.
There's
Valentina. Yes.
Can I push you?
Valentina was just like.
I genuinely loved it. Can I push you on the issue of methodology that I think Federico touched upon something. I think there is an inherent tension between the use of, when Federico asked about meritocracy,
yeah,
and how you define it, your first answer was, I don't define it.
Yeah.
But actually, ultimately you do. I mean, how do you,
right.
I think I see that there is a tension there between the specificity of historical context, where meritocracy, but also as Phil was saying, even simply the civic or the groups, etc., and how within that historical context that issue and what you need are sort of a broader analytical or almost ontological definitions that will allow you to create a meaningful comparative system.
Yeah. So again, you're exactly right, and I didn't mean to deflect the question because it was irrelevant, but I meant to deflect the question because I mean, in some respects, what I do is. So I look at the source, let's say about like a community in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I see that they use the word meritocracy, right? This is why I spent about 7 months fixing the work of my arrays, who collected the early data. I see the word meritocracy, and I'm sort of like, knee-jerk reaction. I'm going to code this as some meritocracy. Like I'm going to add the little meritocracy like tab into the database. But then I read more, and I try to understand what meritocracy actually means in this context. It's me, and this is my problem. Because if I look at like, let's say like 17th century France, I probably have a good sense of what that means in the cultural context, in this context of the evolution of institutions within the Western tradition. If I am looking at Sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, I don't have that same level of certainty. But I'm looking at the source, and again, I look at the sources. The problem is that some of these sources are like, Cortés, problematic. One might say. I look at secondary evidence that takes into account Cortés. There's this like very famous passage in Cortés that says like, oh, the Aztecs look at like Venice, and the people that are writing a paper about this are like, Cortés is full of shit, because of course like he's just like applying his own categories to this situation, and he's missing X, Y, and Z, which we have from archaeological evidence. This is my like golden goose in terms of like the historical evidence that I look at, and the kind of stuff that I try to rely on when I lack the cultural context to do it myself. What I do is that I look more beyond the word meritocracy, and I try to understand the mechanisms. So they say, for example, and this is all in the notes, the meritocratic element operated when people were either good fighters or good people that redistributed their wealth in one way or another, or that something or other. And this is actually like it's simple, much simpler to categorize than what one might think. And so at that point, I'm like, so this is a meritocratic system that takes into account a series of values. In fact, we've been trying to code values. Don't even get me started on that. So I try to like shore up these decisions. And again, I try to track down where in the evidence I see that. In the end, I do make a decision. In the end, I do define meritocracy, but I try to define meritocracy in a way that applies reasonably consistently across cases that are not just European. And that's my criterion.
Thank you very much indeed. There is really plenty more to talk about. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.
When are we reconvening?
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
10 minutes.
That way because people
Hi on Zoom. Can you see the presentation? Yes. Okay. This is
Good, so I can see the
fantastic.
presentation. We're good. We're good to go.
They must be able to hear as well.
Just James can't see it, but that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get started then, so people can catch their trains. Welcome to the final session today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce James Cork Webster, who is currently reader in classics at King's College London. James has traveled the world in a way. He was a bit of an academic journeyman before he made his way to Durham, where he was appointed to a lectureship after a short stint as a non-permanent lecturer, and then he became a permanent lecturer. Then he redesigned the ancient history provision in our department and summarily buggered off to go take a job somewhere in London. As a consequence, we remain bereft of his greatness and kindness and excellent teaching and all of the many qualities. He won a teaching award in Durham, which I nominated him for, and he treated me with such contempt afterwards by departing for his beloved South. James is, of course, very well known to most people in this room. He is one of the most important and interesting scholars working on late antiquity in the UK. He is obviously well known for his book Eusebius and Empire, which came out in 2019, I was going to say. And he's also worked a lot on the hagiographic traditions, including an edited volume, which he edited with Christy Gray on this topic. His articles are very well regarded. I shall mention only the one that he was really working hard on when he was here, which is, there are two, I think, that came up from this that are about the accounts of the persecutions of the Christians, where he totally rewrote our understanding of how these things worked. So with great joy, I present to you James, who's speaking on Christians and democracy, death or defense.
Thank you so much, Phil, for that incredibly generous, if heart-plucking introduction. It is a real pleasure to be back in Durham. That is almost entirely Valentina's fault. So Valentina is, as many of you will know, editing the Cambridge History of, or one of the volumes of the Cambridge History of Democracy, which I made the mistake of calling the Cambridge Companion to Democracy yesterday, which didn't go down very well. Cambridge History of Democracy in 3 volumes, which she wanted to include early Christian thought in, a sentiment that I applauded, and because it was Valentina said yes to, and then realized that this was something of a hospital pass, because in previous histories of democracy, of which there have predictably been many, I'm managing multiple screens here, sorry.
You want me to click it through?
There we go, yeah, okay, that's now working on the arrows. Sorry, you're gonna have to forgive me going back and forth. So in previous histories of democracy, of which there have been many, they have never, to my knowledge, included early Christianity. And when you start to think about it, this is not entirely unpredictable. So this is partly because Christianity emerges during the Roman Empire, right, when democracy is usually assumed to be dying, if not already long deceased. Partly because of Christianity's valorization of an unchallengeable divine authority, which has traditionally been seen as making kind of meaningful democracy redundant. And that valorization has infused a well-known autocracy of church leadership in the medieval papacy, now much maligned, and then partly in this sort of unholy triumvirate because of the modern church's systematic rearguard action in resistance to people power movements within the modern Catholic Church in particular. And an initial perusal of early Christian texts, I think, appears to justify this conclusion. The earliest Christian authors express, if not approval, then certainly acceptance of the autocratic status quo
of their day. So this is most famously epitomized in Jesus' supposed advice to give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's. Very famous statement in Mark, repeated in other Gospels. Paul's elaboration of the sentiment has arguably been even more influential when he says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except for God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God," seen as essentially justifying not just the Roman Empire, but kind of post-Roman autocratic regimes as well. And in the later New Testament, that kind of idea becomes common. So, for example, the injunction to accept the authority of every institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors, in 1 Peter. And in later Christian writings of the first 4 centuries, to which I'm going to confine my attentions today, you get this idea worked out in an explicit hitching of Christianity to the Roman Empire's wagon, as it were. This is arguably most famous in a guy called Melito of Sardis, who said, "Our philosophy first grew up among the barbarians, but its full flower came among your nation in the great reign of your ancestor Augustus, and became an omen of good to your empire, for from that time the power of the Romans became great and splendid." This becomes a kind of classic idea in early Christian thought. It's repeated by Origen, and it's then immortalized by my old friend Eusebius of Caesarea in the early 4th century, the so-called or self-proclaimed first Christian historian. Eusebius actually goes even further. So he extends the Pauline idea that divine authority must lie behind earthly authority to Constantine, the, again, allegedly first Christian emperor, and produces the following immortal sentiment. Here we go. This is a historically accurate portrait of Eusebius. He says, and this passage is very famous, "He grows strong in his model of monarchic rule, which the ruler of all has given to the race of man, alone of those on earth. For this is the law of royal authority, the law which decrees one rule over everybody. Monarchy excels all other kinds of constitution and government, for rather do anarchy and civil war result from the alternative, a polyarchy based on equality." Now, there's some debate as to what that polyarchy based on equality that he's critiquing actually is. So it might be democracy, it might be the tetrarchy of kind of co-rule between 4 emperors of the late 3rd and early 4th centuries. Either way, this has been credited as being the sort of the final nail in the coffin of democracy in some ways, an idea that supposedly underpins the later church's embrace of autocracy, so-called Caesaro-papism, that developed in the Byzantine and medieval periods. And in Paul Cartledge's biography of democracy, which was the wrong one, which was in that list I showed you there. There you go on the right, which is the 2016, the most recent of those 3 books. Eusebius, in fact, appears on the very last page of the kind of first third of the book, before he moves to talk about decline and death of democracy, and is the harbinger of what Cartledge calls the long post-antique medieval twilight of democracy. So in many ways, Christianity is positioned in this narrative as being the kind of if not the kind of the final killer, then the institution that kind of kicks democracy on its way down, and as sort of finally, as I said, nailing the coffin shut. This is the traditional narrative of where Christianity fits, and not a particularly inspiring subject for Valentine's history. But democracy studies, like the times, are, as many of you know, and has already been discussed in this conference, changing. So under the influence of post-colonialism, the most recent publications take a broader approach to democracy to try and deprivilege Athens, despite Paul Cartledge's efforts, and paint a broader picture. And Frederica has already referenced some of some of these works in her previous presentation. Now, to date, none of these has actually included early Christianity either. I think in part because old habits die hard, and the narrative of late antique cultural decline is fairly deep-rooted. But what they have done, I think, is to my mind, correctly insisted on a more democratic definition, or a broader definition of what counts as democracy, which isn't constrained by the idiosyncratic elements of the one historical case study, as, again, Frederica has demonstrated to us, how kind of singular the Athenian examples in some ways are. and nor, given the limitations of Athenian democracy in practice, should practical failings be a barrier to consideration. So this, I think, provides a new basis for considering early Christianity and democracy. I should say that I am entirely eschewing the tempestuous waters of Christian attitudes to empire in general. It's true that the positive sentiments about the Roman Empire that I gave you above do go hand in hand with strident criticism, and some scholars have said that early Christianity as a whole is broadly conceived a sort of anti-imperial enterprise. All that being said, though, you would be hard pushed to find a Christian voice advocating for democracy in secular government, right, in Roman government in the period. So instead, what I want to do is adopting the prompt of broadening our conception of democratic thought to consider kind of internal attitudes to their own polity. And I am interested here in kind of attitudes rather than the practices that they may or may not reflect in writers of the first 3 centuries. And what you get there is, I think, exactly what you'd expect of a set of texts produced by disparate authors across 3 centuries, which is a series of tensions between what we might call praise or attempts at collective governance and the pressures of the development of church hierarchy and the long evolution of the episcopal authority in particular, which occurs in this period. Now, the consensus sees the latter, so the development of hierarchies, as squeezing out kind of proto-democratic sentiments in the earliest Christian church. I would say, in fact, that both of these things are present from the start. So I should say that in the wake of Vatican II, so in the second half of the 20th century, there was a flurry of work that tried to excavate the kind of proto-democratic substrate, which had kind of been buried under the later accrual of the development of the clergy. And I mean, there are a lot of examples of this, but the most famous, or the best in some ways, intellectually the best, is a very famous feminist theologian, Elizabeth of Fiorenza, who wrote The Discipleship of Equals, a critical feminist ecclesiology, in which was, I think, the most intellectually robust attempt at what was a broader sentiment, which was to show that democracy was the kind of the proto inclination of the church at its earliest levels, and this was in some sense buried by the kind of later developments, which was, I mean, is a version of a more general kind of almost Weberian narrative of kind of early charismatic authority being, and Fiorenza even talks about kind of charismatic democracy, which is then buried under kind of the institutionalization of the church. One thing I want to show is that actually I think these sentiments coexist from the very beginnings of Christianity, that as with a lot of other subjects, there is this kind of tension between kind of democratic urges and hierarchization from the earliest layer of the church, but that both of them also continue right the way through to the 4th century. So rather than the one being present at the beginning and then getting squeezed out, I actually think you can see a continuation of democratic sentiment through the first 3 centuries, and even in my ongoing attempt at rehabilitation in Eusebius himself. Now, I'm going to suggest today that tension, that constant tension, is characteristic of the socio-political life of the imperial provinces as a whole. And this is where I'd be very grateful for feedback from those of you that know more about that than me, which is, of course, the milieu in which the Greek East, in particular, where the church was born and grew. Western Christianity is sort of in its infancy for much of these first 3 centuries. And in some ways, I think you can say that the early Christians, or the question is whether the early Christians go further than their non-Christian peers in their attempts to preserve democracy. And in some ways, I think the jury is out on that. So that's where kind of this work has got to. Okay, so now for a kind of very brief sketch of some of these kind of competing tendencies in early Christian literature. I'm not going to go through all of this because there is obviously a lot of early Christian literature, but just to give you a few examples to demonstrate the themes, and some of it I think is in some ways quite surprising. So one text which is often excavated here is, Andrea, what have you done?
Yeah, because I had to admit Roberta on Zoom. Okay.
Wicked. Right. Yeah, there you go. So this is actually an early representation of Paul from a 6th century mosaic. Yeah. So the passage of Paul in 1 Corinthians gets drawn out quite a lot, and we're going to come back to this later in the paper. So I've sort of picked out this example. So playing on again what is a well-known metaphor of the body politic in the ancient world, Paul talks about the Christian community as being a body. And just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. He then goes on to emphasize the members' equal value and equal kind of contribution to the church. So the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor, and our less respectable members are treated with greater respect. He then goes on to talk about activities. He says there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and the varieties of service, but the same Lord, and there are varieties of activities, but it's the same God who activates all of them in everyone. Now, this is obviously not directly about governance, but it has the sort of the sentiment of group equality that it speaks to is at the core of someone like Fiorenza's attempt to discuss democracy in early Christianity. So she uses this as a basis of what she calls a pneumatic or charismatic democracy. And again, you can see the Weberian kind of influence there, I think. But it's important to remember that that passage concludes by saying God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then deeds of power, then gifts of healing. So right at that earliest kind of proto-democratic sentiment, you also have the evolving, ideas of hierarchies also being necessary. So the idea that this hierarchization comes in later, I think, won't fly. It's there right from the start in Paul. There's more in Paul we could discuss, various passages in the Gospels as well. So Jesus says, for example, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants. But it's not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. John also talks about the entire community becoming children of God. But again, all of these are sort of not directly, I suppose, talking about governance so much as the sort of relative equality of members of the community. But they underlie, I think, what we start to find in Acts, which is the sort of continuation of the 4 Gospels, where we start to see the sort of the first discussions of how the church governed itself, or the memory in the early 2nd century when Acts is written of how the earliest church governed itself. And here, what we find is quite interesting. Here we go. There's Paul. That's Luke, author of Luke's Gospel, also Luke of Acts. So the first thing that the early Christian community has to do is deal with Judas, or deal with the hole that Judas has left in the 12 disciples. So they have to choose a replacement. And what happens is that Peter takes charge, because he's been given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and speaks first. But the candidates are then proposed and assessed by the amassed community, which is described as being a crowd of about 120 people. So they proposed 2 candidates after Peter said, look, we're going to have to do something about this. And then they prayed, they cast lots. And this happens again later on in Acts 6. Some of the disciples feel that they're being overworked, so they say, look, we don't want to be dealing with the sort of day-to-day admin of the church. We've got bigger spiritual fish to fry, so we're going to choose 7 lackeys that are going to kind of do the grafting for us. And again, when those are spoken, it's the 12 disciples who speak to the need for a choice, and they confirm it, but the text again affirms the agency of the whole community of the disciples. What they said pleased the whole community, and it's the community that chooses. And then they had those men stand before the apostles who prayed and laid hands on them. So there seems to be some mode of collective government, or certainly collective involvement in the decision-making in the earliest church. But already you see, I think in the second example in particular, a kind of move from towards representative rather than direct democracy, which is again something we see throughout the early Christian examples. Now, throughout Acts, the collective regularly has a role in decisions. Peter, when he gets in trouble for eating with Gentiles, has to justify himself not to the other disciples, but to the entire community. the Jerusalem Council, which is the memory of the earliest. This is Acts 15, which is supposedly the first church council, right? It's when James the Just and Peter and Paul hash out their disagreements on essentially the kind of the relationship with Judaism in the earliest church. Very controversial as to whether this actually happened, and there's a different picture of it in Galatians. What's interesting for us is the kind of 2nd century memory of how that first council went. And again, what happens is that Paul and Barnabas come to speak with apostles and elders, and the apostles and elders then meet alone, and Peter speaks and James decides. But at the same time, the two of them report to the church as a whole, and we're told that the whole assembly kept silence and listened to them. The resulting decision is made by the apostles and the elders, but with the consent of the whole church. And the letter that's then sent out is collectively, supposedly collectively authored by the community as a whole. We have decided unanimously to choose representatives and send them to you. We have therefore sent Judas and Silas. The details of what they decide is not important to us. So the letter assigns collective credit for both for the election of representatives and for the substantive decision, which is made supposedly by James. So again, there's this sort of nascent hierarchies in the church sit side by side with at least the assertion of some genuine collective agency. It seems to be important in the 2nd century to assert that the whole community as a whole was somehow involved in these decisions. What I think we get here in Acts, in these two passages that I've showed you, is a sort of embedding of democratic sentiments in descriptions of two practices, which we might dub elections and councils. And it's those two broadly conceived ideas that then run. There's two places, I suppose, in which we find this kind of ongoing tension between hierarchization and democracy throughout the next kind of 200 years of Christian history. There you go. So I'm just going to give you a kind of 1 or 2 examples of each rather than running through everything. So the Didache, which is an early Christian text that almost gets into the New Testament, but doesn't quite make the cut at the last minute, tells its readers that they should elect for themselves bishops and deacons. 1 Clement talks about clerical appointments made with the entire church giving its approval. Origen says to the congregation that you also are priests of the Lord. And then he says explicitly that in ordaining a priest, the presence of the people is required. Hippolytus is the example I've given you here, because it's a little bit more substantive. So again, the emphasis on the involvement of the people here is repeated and is really the key theme that he clearly wants to bring out. Let the bishop be ordained, as we pointed above, having been elected by all the people, omni populo, when he's been named and found pleasing to all. Let the people come together with the presbyters and any bishops who are present on the Lord's day. When all give their consent, they lay hands on him, and the presbytery stands in silence, and all shall keep silence, praying in their hearts for the descent of the Holy Spirit. After this, at the request of all, one of the bishops who's present lays a hand on him, etc., etc. Right? So there's this repeated assertion that elections are only valid if the whole community, in some sense, gives its assent to the choice. In Cyprian as well, on councils. In the letters of Cyprian, who's so a 3rd century bishop in Carthage, whose letter corpus is preserved for us, and thus tells us a lot about the kind of nitty-gritty of kind of episcopal problems in the 3rd century. He talks about our custom when we make appointments to clerical office to consult you, the people, beforehand. There we're told that another letter says that the plebs, the faithful, have in their own hands the power to select bishops who are worthy and to reject those who are unworthy. Priestly appointments are not to be made without the cognizance and attendance of the people, etc., etc., etc. Right, that same sentiment runs throughout, and it's not just in Carthage, but it's in Rome. In Rome as well. Fine. This is not just about elections, it's also about church councils. Just choosing which examples to include. So this is, I'll come on to that in a second. So after that Acts Council, we don't have much evidence of gatherings until the late 2nd century, even though we know that there were many, many councils kind of going on informally and formally. But Origen talks about councils where bishops seem to dominate, but he also says the whole church is here listening. And he says he was willing to speak with the permission of God and of the bishops and of the presbyters and of all the people. So some sense again in which the sort of the agency of the people is important at collective gatherings. Cyprian again gives us perhaps the best example here. At the same time as he is at times insists on the authority of the bishop to do whatever he wants, in essence. When it suits him, he also will say, when writing, unsurprisingly, to the laity, I can make no reply of my own, for it's been a resolve of mine, right from the beginning of my episcopate, to do nothing on my own private judgment without your counsel and the consent of the people. And the Roman clergy, when they write to Cyprian, say, it appears to us to be excessively invidious and oppressive to examine without the advice of many people an offence committed by many people, and we need to, it says it's impossible for a decree to be firm unless it shall appear to have received the consent of the majority. So examples like this abound. Now this brings us back to the end of this first 4 centuries to our man Eusebius. Eusebius talks a lot, or he's our main evidence for a lot of church councils, and he gives us a lot of different cases of these, and in particular of collective decision making. His focus is usually on church leadership. He's interested in the institution, but there's a couple of examples that haven't actually been discussed previously in literature on early Christian democracy that I think are quite interesting. So what I want to focus on is the council supposedly convened in the mid-3rd century to deal with a supposed heretic called Paul of Samosata, who becomes Bishop of Antioch in this period. There's a whole song and dance about his beliefs on the nature of Christ and God, which we thankfully won't go into today. But what's interesting is he quotes from a letter of the bishops attacking the heretical Bishop Paul. And what he is criticized for is quite interesting, and you can see it here. So he's criticized for what's called the quackery in church assemblies that he devises, astonishing the minds of the simpler folk, which involves a tribunal and a lofty throne and the Sacratum. And such behavior in imitation of the rulers of the world is explicitly contrasted with that befitting a disciple of Christ. And the letter goes on later to explicitly use the language of tyranny and power. So this kind of when Paul acts hierarchically as a bishop, he is condemned, right? The cleric is supposed, ideally, to identify with and act with the explicit kind of support of the demos, the ecclesia of the church. Fine. But then there's this additional passage that comes a little bit afterwards. Sorry. There we go, it was already there at the bottom, where he says, it also condemns Paul because he smites his hand on his thigh and stamps the tribunal with his feet, and those who do not applaud or wave their handkerchiefs, as in a theatre, or shout out and jump up, in the same way as do the men and wretched women who are his partisans and hearken in this disorderly fashion, cosmos, but who listen as in God's house with orderly and becoming reverence, these he rebukes and insults. So this is the nearest thing I can find to the sort of almost Aristotelian critique of direct democracy as being akin to anarchy, right? That if everyone is doing whatever they want, this is not proper democracy. So this is, I think you can see a kind of implicit justification of the representative rather than the direct democracy. So the congregation is supposed to be involved, but again, in a kind of secondary or deferential manner. Now, the final council of our period is the most famous, which is the Nicene Council of 325. And most of what we know about that, again, comes from Eusebius. And Eusebius, again, for the most part, emphasizes collectivity, unity, etc., worldwide council. But one thing that's particularly interesting and I think under-commented is that he explicitly calls it a repeat of the apostolic gathering in Acts that supposedly occurred at Pentecost. And he then invokes that Pauline language from 1 Corinthians of diverse gifts and echoes exactly the same language. Some were outstanding for the word of wisdom, others for their severity of life and patient endurance, others were adorned for their moderation. He's talking about the bishops of the council, but he's explicitly using that Pauline language of equality of the community. And you get the language of strength and weakness. Again, I won't go into that in the interest of time. And explicitly says the bishops are joined together in a single body. So he's pointing people towards that Pauline somatic body politic metaphor. Now, quotations of the New Testament are very rare in the life of Constantine. There aren't many of them. So there is a very deliberate attempt to emphasize the continuity of the church between the 1st and the 4th centuries and its democratic nature, if we can call it that. But there is an interesting extra line here, which I think gives quite a lot of insight into his thinking when he qualifies the comparison, because he says, except that they were inferior, the apostles were at the apostolic community gathering at Pentecost, he says, was inferior because not all consisted of ministers of God. So this is the shift from direct to representative democracy writ large, right? That what's in the Bible is worse than what we have because we only had the bishops together, right? And what's interesting is we know that there were in fact lay members present at Nicaea, right? Because another Sozomen, the later church historian, gives us a strong impression that they were there. So Eusebius is actually kind of misrepresenting it in order to make the claim that only bishops got together, and this is good. This is proper democracy. Why is it proper democracy? Because so this is his description of what happens in the build-up to the council, right? What happens beforehand. So the dispute had already reached the other provinces and cities so that it was possible to see not only the leaders of the church sparring with words, but the multitudes also fragmented, some inclining to one side, some to the other. The spectacle of these events reached such absurdity that sacred points of divine doctrine were now subjected to disgraceful mockery publicly in the theatres of the unbelievers. The bishop of one city was attacking the bishop of another, populations were rising up against one another, and all but coming to physical blows with each other, so that desperate men out of their minds were committing sacrilegious acts, even daring to insult the images of the emperor. So for Eusebius, the real problem with what happened at Nicaea was basically the public airing of the church's dirty theological laundry, right? This stuff should have been kept in-house. Then the reason that happened is because discussion has spread from the circle of qualified bishops to the broader Christian community, and when the people start discussing it, then things get ugly. And the sort of escalation here, they get as ugly as they can possibly get, even to the extent of treason, right? The images of the worst possible thing that can happen in the life of a Greek city, civic strife. And Eusebius makes much in the ecclesiastical history of the lack of this kind of ugly disagreement in the church. Not that difference of opinion never arose, but it always arises in a forum where qualified individuals can sort it out. So again, this I think sort of explains that critique of what we might call direct democracy in the church, and this sort of explanation of why it's better if it's just you have representative bishops doing the discussion. And I think there are interesting parallels. So my sense is there are interesting parallels here with the kinds of critique of democracy that you're getting in the classical period, about which I'm not in any way an expert. Okay, that's a whistle-stop tour. There's a lot more that could be said about that. So alongside this debate over the democratic credentials of early Christians, there's been another slightly lower key debate over the extent to which those credentials were influenced by the wider Greco-Roman context. Now, one dimension of that is obviously the term ecclesia. Where does that term come from? Does it come from the Septuagint, where it translates the Hebrew kahal, which is the one of the terms used for the gathering of the Jewish community, along with the synagogue and various other terms? Or is it inheritance from the Greek democratic legacy of ecclesia? I think the consensus probably leans towards the Hebrew, but without immersing ourselves in those etymological semantics. I think the point is that the attempt to produce a definitive answer here is wrong-headed, right? Even if we could determine the influences of one Christian author, which it's actually very difficult to do, we could never know those of everybody employing the term, and they're also not mutually exclusive, right? So in the multicultural communities of the Greek East, it seems likely that both legacies of the term are, if not being directly invoked, then are in the background, right? I don't think you can use the term ecclesia in the Greek East without and insist that only has an inheritance from the Septuagint, right? That seems a kind of ludicrous position. There's another dimension to this as to whether Christian conciliary structure deliberately paralleled the Roman Senate, which we are not going to get into today, which is surprisingly heated. Again, the consensus tries to limit that influence on the kind of the Roman example. Now, what's interesting is that the rejection of those provincial parallels is based on a perceived absence of any real democratic life in the Greek provinces in this period. And if you look at the references in this Christian work, it's all to mid-century scholarship on kind of Greek political life in the imperial period, which basically says the Greek cities are bereft of any meaningful democracy in this period. Right? Now, as you guys will know much better than me, that has been challenged in recent years, which I was very interested to learn about. So these are just 3 examples that I found helpful. There's masses more scholarship on this, but Dmitriev's book, this really good article actually on the political sociology of the imperial Greek city, and then Brelas has endless publications on the democratic life of Greek cities during the Roman Empire. And there's a lot there, and there's a load of other authors as well. This is just a sort of sampling, so that as I understand it, and I'm very happy to push back on this, but as I understand it, that the traditional assumption of democratic decline was based on not just the fact of the Roman conquest, but the increasing visibility and dominance of a wealthy oligarchic elite that the Romans sort of helped create and support, as well as increasing hierarchization of local society in general. But this kind of scholarship seems to identify persistent evidence of local democratic power, whether it be civic, you find it in documents, epitaphs, testaments, coins, etc., etc. The proceedings of local assemblies, such as we know them, speak not to a kind of moribund, oppressed autocracy, but to genuine local debate, and not just debate over honors to elites, but meaningful kind of attempts to shape the political life of the cities. And at the same time, non-elite collectives of the collegia, who've already been mentioned above all, have an ever-increasing importance, right? So there are these different ways in which actually the Greek life of the imperial cities, which is the context in which Christianity is growing, is still in some sense meaningfully democratic. And there are various additional things that we can talk about that. And this is not my area of expertise, but this seems, as far as I can tell, to be the kind of the new consensus, right? And an interest as well in unanimity and consensus in this period. Now, Zederhoek, as I think, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he's argued that the clue to understanding that apparent tension is the fact that much of that evidence is related to euergetism, but that represents a balancing act which echoed the formation of the Principate itself, where elite gift-giving and demos bestowed honors were part of the process of helping all parties become comfortable with the changing status quo towards hierarchization, but that the continuation of real popular politics should be ascribed to the rise of urban manufacturers and traders who benefited economically from the Pax Romana, or what we might call the sort of the middle class. And in particular, they were the people who made up the collegia, who were establishing their position in the urban landscape and the urban ecclesiae, and thus had a real vested interest in having a genuine kind of say in the assemblies. Very interested to see if that argument sort of passes muster in a room of experts. But from my perspective, this is interesting because this is the local world in which the earliest Christians are gathering, debating, and electing their leaders, and by which I would suggest they were influenced. Now, in fact, Christians themselves make this comparison. This is the hooded Origen, who says in the Contra Celsum, God caused churches to exist in opposition to the assemblies of superstitious, licentious, and unrighteous men, for such is the character of the crowds who everywhere constitute the assemblies of the city. So if we ignore the sort of negative sentiments here, that his use of the ecclesia language is in direct kind of contrast, or he sees the Christians as in some sense being kind of parallel, comparative to the ecclesiae of the Greek cities of the East. So this is certainly where Christians seem to be thinking about their own governance. Now, the Greek civic background has been suggested before for odds and sods within early Christian writings. But what I'm suggesting, I think, is that the very tensions between the recurrence of democratic principles and the evolution of hierarchies that we see in earliest Christianity are in fact exactly what we would expect of a collective growing in the Greek East at this time, since that tension between sort of persistent democracy and of an evolving hierarchization in the cities is what we find in the wider context as well. So in this, as in many other things, I would suggest Christians are in fact unremarkable. Okay, so final section. So Zuiderhout urges scholars to focus less on cities' political structures and more on the particular socio-political collectives within them, if we want to understand democracy in this period. And despite their neglect, early Christian churches are one such collective. Christianity was born of precisely that trading and mercantile demographic that Zuiderhout thinks was key to the continuing democratic life of the provinces. You know, Paul was a tent maker, famously a tent maker, and it's been shown many times that Christianity is growing and spreading via precisely that kind of trade network. It's no coincidence, for example, that in Ephesus, in Acts, Paul's perceived threat to the city is in fact a threat to Ephesian artisans, since this is precisely the social level at which Christians interacted. Incidentally, an example that also uses the language of mutual ecclesiae. And there is a whole cottage industry of scholarship around comparing early Christian churches and collegia, which I won't get into today, but I mean, as far as I can tell, the jury is still slightly out on that as to whether that is a meaningful comparison or not. But it would seem interesting that, again, the Christians are overlapping with precisely the demographics and groupings for whom the democratic elements of Greek provincial society are most meaningful and important, the kind of mercantile kind of stratigraphic layer of society and the collegia in particular. So I think it's worth interesting what early Christian thought adds to our picture of that world. Now, the big question then, I suppose, is whether Christians don't just echo these wider tensions between democratic and hierarchical tendencies, but whether they go further in their commitment to democracy. And this is where I'm, I suppose, slightly less sure of myself. So the most famous element here is the passage that we already mentioned yesterday, which is Paul's statement concerning the body of Christ, which is a very, very famous passage. But that there is, in the Christian community, there is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus, which not only takes it as read that different ethnicities, slaves and women, are community members, but that goes further in insisting on a universal symbolic equality between them. Now, there's a sort of question mark over the degree to which that kind of radical equality exists within the Greek cities of the East and in the collegia in particular, which is why I was so interested in Ben's inscription that he showed us yesterday. And there's a kind of wider bit of work to be done here on the extent to which in Roman period associations, these social divisions were also elided. There is a famous passage on dining in 1 Corinthians, which it's tempting again, where Paul says, you know, you should all be eating together, and you're in fact instead you seem to be kind of there seems to be some kind of hierarchy amongst you when you're eating, that the wealthiest members of society are eating first, etc., which it's tempting to see as being a reaction to precisely the kind of social stratification in Greek urban political life we were talking about before. So it's possible that Christian thinking goes further in its democratic thrust, but possibly also in a deliberate contrast to certain elements of contemporary society that it perceived as a threat to democracy. But that's quite a big claim. If we go back to that Acts passage before, the election of Judas's replacement, the implication there is that both men and women vote. It's also interesting in the early church that although a lot of bishops are the same kind of the usual suspects of local big men who might hold wider civic office, we know that there are at least one and possibly two and possibly more slaves who become bishops in the early Christian community. One at least is secure. Quite likely there's a second as well. The famous one is a guy called Callistus, 2nd century bishop of Rome, no less. And then there may also have been someone called Onesimus. There might have been two people called Onesimus, but I'm not going to get into the kind of debates around that today. But again, it certainly seems to reflect the idea that slaves could be bishops in this period. And there's no signs of property qualifications, etc. So again, there's a question mark. Does that go further than associations did in the Greek world? The homogenization, so that the claims to unanimity of church councils again reflect an interesting consensus in this period more broadly, both at Rome and in the Greek East. But Eusebius and other Christian authors certainly claim that the Christian ecclesia is the best exemplar of that broader attempt to reach consensus. So the claim is that they say, at least, is that the Christian ecclesia is a more effective collective body than its contemporaries, and thus better positioned to deal with the kind of the crises of the 3rd century, etc. And it's the efficacy of the democratic councils, supposedly, that make Christianity superior. All of which brings us back full circle to Eusebius, whose pro-monarchic sentiments sounded, as we saw at the start, for some the death knell of democracy. And it's certainly true that Eusebius was no revolutionary. He was a firm advocate for the clerical hierarchy, and he was, on favor in no critique of imperialism. But I think neither position is particularly surprising for a bishop on the fringes of the imperial court in the early 4th century. But what I'd like to suggest in closing is that in his depiction of councils at which emperors were involved, so Nicaea, he in fact worked quite hard to try to preserve the idea of collective agency, even if representative rather than direct, against the threat of autocratic involvement. So there is another way, I think, of seeing Eusebius's famed depiction of Constantine, of the monarch with which we started here, which Carthage sees as being the kind of the end of democracy, the death of democracy. So here we go, back to Eusebius. So the idea that Eusebius was inviting imperial involvement in the councils and thus establishing what became known as Caesaropapism, the sort of unity of autocracy and the church, ignores the chronology of when Eusebius was writing. So Eusebius is writing both the praise of Constantine and the life of Constantine after 335, right? A decade after Nicaea. So the council and Constantine's behavior after it were long in the past. Constantine didn't need a provincial bishop that he hardly knew to legitimize his behavior at the empire. That's not what Eusebius is writing to do. He's not providing a kind of justification for Constantine. Constantine had already acted as he had acted at Nicaea, and I would argue had acted in a very roughshod way, as you would expect a Roman emperor to do. Eusebius was writing it was a sort of an attempt to shut the stable door after the horses bolted 10 years later, to try to contain the way that the emperor had kind of inserted himself into church affairs, to try and preserve some degree of autonomy for the bishops. So, I mean, I won't go into the details of Nicaea too much, but Constantine clearly, in his preserved letters, regarded the whole thing as being extremely trivial and quite unworthy of such controversy. He summons the bishops. He changes the venue unilaterally to suit himself. He may well have dictated the agenda. At the council, he was still frustrated. He wades into the theological debates of the bishops, about which he clearly didn't understand very much. And the term that has become the kind of the key Christian term for understanding the relationship between God and Christ, which is a word called homoousios, which means being of the same substance. I promise that's the closer we're going to get to the theology. That term comes from Constantine, right? Constantine says, this is how we're going to solve it. It is a terrible theological choice, right? The term had already been anathematized at an earlier council, and the bishops just have to make the best of it, right? This seems to be the best reconstruction of Nicaea. So Constantine had acted exactly as you would expect an irritated emperor would be at having to attend a sort of the gathering of a religious collective that was important, but which he didn't really kind of believe in the intricacies of. Now compare Eusebius's depiction of it, right? This post facto depiction of the emperor's interactions with the church. He works as hard as he can to lessen the implicit hierarchies and insist on the authority of the collective. There's a lot of different passages I could have, oh, sorry, I'm already there. I could have discussed it. Sorry, there we go. So when he talks about Constantine, he says explicitly that he leaves the soldiers at the door, right? And so when he enters the gathering, he is acting not as emperor, but as one of the collective. He was adorned with fear and reverence of God. His eyes were downcast, the blush on his face, his gait. He speaks of only when the bishops assented did he sit down. He looked kindly on them. He spoke in a soft and gentle voice. He said, I always wanted to share your company, which seems unlikely to be true. He says he makes way for the leaders of the council to speak. He acts with every deference, Eusebius says, addressing them as fathers or prophets of God, and then addresses the congregation themselves, speaks to the laity as being his own brothers and fellow servants, and famously Eusebius describes Constantine as being like a bishop himself, right? There's a whole cottage industry around that, on which I've published and which I would happily talk about. The point here is that Eusebius is working very hard here to democratize, I would argue, the memory of the emperor's interactions with the church. And the success of Eusebius's efforts, by the way, is evident in the fact that scholars' long naive belief that Constantine actually behaved this way at Nicaea, right, which seems, for various reasons, incredibly unlikely to be true. So as Eusebius depicts it, Constantine acts here not as emperor, but as bishop, as one more bishop among many, respecting the interactions of the collective, rubber stamping the decision that they make. And this support is in contrast to kind of non-Christian emperors who supposedly ordered that synods of bishops should never dare to meet anyway. And Eusebius is writing in 337 for the emperor's sons, right? So for the next Constantinian generation, a kind of mirror for princes, and is trying to shape how those new rulers are going to interact with the church. Now, on this lens, I think Eusebius becomes not the figure who finally stamped the life out of democracy, but its last-ditch defender, fighting to try and preserve one facet of the democratic life of the provinces from extinction. I'd be interested as to whether that kind of picture carries water. So all of this to say that early Christianity is, I think, a missing piece in the puzzle of the new map of democratic thought beyond Athens that scholars have been trying to produce. Early Christian writers have very little to say about democracy as a system of government in wider society, but they do witness a persistent interest in the power and agency of the collective congregation. And the tension of that and kind of evolving hierarchy is characteristic of not just the churches, but the broader Greek world. And arguably, I think you can say Christians were as deeply committed, or arguably more deeply committed to democratic principles, in particular extending of the franchise to all community members, than their peers, although that's in some ways, I suppose, the most questionable part of the argument. And even Eusebius of Caesarea, who was emblematic of casual dismissal of democracy, can actually be seen as a thinker deeply committed to preserving the democratic nature of Christianity. And I'd be interested in the kind of what the legacy of that would then look like. So Wolf Lieberschutz famously called the bishop in late antiquity the most permanent functionary and the only one who'd achieved his position by popular consent. There's been very little interest in late antique democracy as well, and there's a lot more that could be said about the role of Christian thought in it. What is the role of Christianity in the rehabilitation of the Byzantine world as a democratic republic? And I'm interested for those of you, as we saw yesterday, who are interested in the kind of the modern rebirth of democracy, as to, you know, whether in France, England, or New England, many of those revolutionaries were as deeply versed in Christianity as they were in classics. So I wonder what the role of Christian democratic thought might be in those kind of modern reimaginings as well. So there is more to say, I think, about the legacy of Christian democracy. So thank you.
We've got time for questions. Some questions, some ideas, thoughts. Yeah, Federico?
Yeah, I actually had a couple questions. In some of the stuff that you showed us from the early democracy version, I saw the echo of some of the stuff that I encounter when I see data about the collective government institutions that I look at. And sometimes what puzzles me is the use of words that we associate almost immediately with democratic spaces, that being exactly the opposite. So consensus is one, for example, because you can reach consensus in a variety of ways, but many of which are not democratic at all. And so I'm wondering if you have any sense of any of this sort of like a semantic shifts happening in the early evidence that you are that you're showing us, and in some sense, like the way that one would show up that concern would be to look at some of the mechanisms that were actually in place in order to reach decisions. I don't know if the evidence is there. If it is, I would be very interested in it, as you can probably imagine. But some of those words struck me as potentially trying to say something that was then not supported in the life of the institution, so to speak.
Yeah, good question. So there's a kind of number of different ways of coming at this. So it's certainly true that this is all an assessment of kind of early Christian writing about and thinking about practice rather than practice. So I would be very, very cautious of making any claims here about actual Christian practice for a lot of this evidence. Certainly for all of the Acts evidence, right? That does not reflect what's happening in the first century. What we find in Cyprian, for example, is more interesting. I mean, Cyprian does seem to. It has a better chance, at least, of reflecting practical, what's actually going on the ground. But again, Cyprian is very mixed, right? That actually, I think it's very clear that things are less democratic than he sometimes wants to present them as, and that if the laity have a role, it's probably a secondary one in that period. So that's the first thing. There's definitely things on the ground are probably not as democratic as some of the authors are maintaining, but it's then interesting as to why the idea is important. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is, yes, there are semantic shifts in this period. Now, the best example of this is that Cassius Dio calls, without any apparent irony, calls the imperial system a democracy. Right, so the things reach full. That he describes autocracy as a democracy, and there's obviously something going on here to do with the sort of the alleged role of the Roman people, the Roman plebs, in making decisions in the Republic, in the sense that the Republic has been restored by the emperors in some sense. But Cassius Dio is writing, I think it's Dio, I need to look this up, is writing in the 3rd century. So the Cartledge has a lot of this. Cartledge says that basically democracy dies because the word dies, it becomes meaningless. So there is definitely a sort of democratic language doesn't mean what it did in some sense. So there is something going on there as well. And
if I remember correctly, you correct me if I'm wrong, this is going back to 15 years or something, when I wrote on Cassius Dio, God knows why. He calls ecclesia is the standard word he uses for the plebeian council. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Someone else might know better than me, but yeah.
Interesting if so.
Anyway, it was just a footnote about these questions of terminology. Yeah.
So there is certainly a shift, and I mean, again, I'm not trying. In some ways, it's the exercise for the thing I was writing was to see how far I could push the argument on democracy. I mean, I really wouldn't. There is a decline in some sense. I mean, this just goes back to the classic language of, like, you know, should we be talking about decline or transformation for the changes that happen in late antiquity? I mean, I don't think it matters too much. The democracy in the classical sense is not alive in this period, I think. And the
right,
Christians,
but again, like for James, that doesn't matter.
Right.
Like, this is not
exactly.
where you know.
But is, you know, I think it is clear that there is meaningful people power in the Greek East under the Empire, and I think it is true that Christian writings speak to a perceived importance of people power in the way that the church thinks about itself, right? That's as far as I would deliberately push it. What I'm really interested in, I can't quite parse, is whether the Christians are unusual or not, and whether they go further. Now, my general take on early Christianity is that they're not exceptional. Most of what I've written has been against Christian exceptionalism, that our whole take on early Christianity is wrong because we privilege it as being a unique example. But there are some ways in which Christianity is kind of different, usually literary, as opposed to in practice. So I wonder whether something to do with this, this legacy of the idea of being the servant of God, etc., leads Christian authors to privilege the idea of kind of collective governance, you know, and extension of the franchise arguably further than do their peers in the Greek East. But the thing I really need to figure out, as I was saying to Ben, is that I don't know yet, is how far the associations go in that direction. And I need to read James's stuff as well on this, which I didn't know about previously.
Thank you. So we've got Anders and then Federico.
Yeah. This is actually to follow up on this question also on the consensus element here. You said something about consensus becoming more and more important, perhaps in this period. So I'm mostly know about the classical period, so it made me think about what's the model they're thinking about here. They're talking about the popular input or role in this. Because it seems that in the classical period, at least, what we also see is that the assembly, kind of in the assembly, the ideology is a consensus idea. So the assembly decisions are what seem to the demas understood as, you know, as a whole. And I think at least the epigraphic stuff very rarely mentions disagreement in assembly decisions. This is something that Mirko Kanamaro has also worked on. This is where I get it from. Whereas in the law courts, for instance, you do get they register that so many people voted for this and so many people. So there's kind of an idea of majority decision as opposed to consensus. So I was wondering about you said something there. What you said about consensus being kind of a recent. Sorry, I don't know if this is a question.
No. It's a. I sort of breezed past it a little bit. Okay, so again, this is from my attempt to kind of learn about phenomena I didn't really know much about before, but it seems like that classical interest in the interest in consensus in epigraphic productions, etc., continues into the Greek period and into the imperial period as well, and possibly gets even stronger. So that's the Zederhoek example used to say the same thing. Klaus Oehler has argued that it becomes a key structural principle in the Principate as well. So this idea of the people being unanimous about which gods were traditionally suspicious is sort of something that the Romans pick up from the Greeks, and it becomes a key kind of political principle. I mean, Federico is frowning. So, so what's interesting in the Christian case is that you find exactly the same thing, and it's been attributed in a lot of cases to the attempt to shut down heresy, right? That you don't want to admit that there are differences of theological opinion, so you sort of say, what one person had a bad idea and everybody else immediately agreed that they had consensus that it was a bad idea.
They have the same spirit. I mean, it goes even one step further. It's not like we all are in concordance or whatever. It's not homonoia or something. It's that everybody has the same psuche, because that's the Christian commitment to spiritual unity. I mean, and that's the way it's reflected in the language as well in the Christian tradition. So
yeah,
if you were to break from that, you'd be breaking apart the body of Christ, or the body of the church,
I suppose what I'm interested in is that all of that stuff, the theological stuff, has been written in total ignorance of this wider phenomenon, right? Which is that consensus is not unique to the Christians, right? That actually this is what every that every decree of every assembly is sort of interested in. So again, it sort of comes back to the same thing: is, are the Christians actually going any further than what is broadly found? But you see, for Eusebius, I argued, when I also didn't know about any of this, that Eusebius makes that unanimity a key principle of his picture of early Christian history, because he's advocating for Christians being a superior corporate body than their peers.
It makes sense.
But actually, what I'm interested in is that just not a particularly surprising thing for someone to do.
Because just very quickly, the thing that unites the ecclesia is the Spirit of God. So it's the psuche or the pneuma, right? So it's going a step higher than, it's super political. If that makes sense. So this is a super political democracy, which is a contradiction in terms, but where the terms matter. I mean, this is that I can see why Eusebius would want to do that. But anyway, I don't want to dominate this. Federico, you had a question.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks, James. Really compelling in all sorts of ways. Two quick questions. First one, can you tell us a bit more about this analogy between collegia and churches, and whether you think it holds water at all? And secondly, do monastic communities play any part whatsoever in this story of Christianity and democracy?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so the collegia question goes back about 34 years, when people started. I mean, I'm sure you could find earlier probably German examples, but it became a kind of hot topic in scholarship, in particular in a guy called John Kloppenborg and Philip Harland, and what's become known as the sort of Toronto School, sort of systematically advocated that the way to understand Christianity is as an association like the other associations, and that this explains early Christian dining practices, so the origins of it are in the burial practices, right? So the Italians and Germans in the 19th, 20th century said the cemetery thing, the collective burial thing, maps the associations. Then this North American group have argued for a much more extensive comparison. That really, this is the way to understand early Christianity in terms of their dining, in terms of their group mentalities, and leadership, etc., right? And it is. The comparison is certainly productive, right? There has been a real pushback, and this is where, I don't know what I think yet, but I have always found it quite compelling. But people I really respect, who know a lot more about the associations, in particular Benedict Eckhart in Edinburgh, who is like the leading, I'd say, scholar of associations, he is very critical of that Canadian school, and has published vocally on how they push those parallels too far. And so his view is that he said all of the work that's been done, in essence, in 30 years, the only conclusions that hold water are the fairly trite ones, that they are gathering and eating together and gathering and burying together, but that he thinks the differences remain unexplained. So, why is it illegal to be a Christian and it's not illegal to be in any other association? Why don't the Christians put up inscriptions in the way that all other associations do, right? And so that's where the difference lies. I haven't had my moment of properly immersing myself in this stuff, so I don't know what I think. What I would say is that one of Benedict's objections is that Christians are illegal, and being Christian is illegal and other associations aren't. I don't think being Christian is illegal, right? This is my current project, which I'm publishing on, but I think that consensus is wrong. that Christianity was illegal, and I'm pretty sure I write about it. So that would knock down one of the objections to the association thing. The epigraphy one, the epigraphy objection, I don't know. So that's where that tension aligns. But I think Benedict wouldn't deny that there are links and that it's a useful comparison to make, but I think he thinks it's been taken too far. Right? Monasteries, that's really interesting. So your traditional view is that this doesn't start until the 4th century on, right? That the sort of rise of asceticism is later, and I have deliberately kind of not gone beyond Constantine, mainly because I didn't want to read Augustine, to be honest. But I mean, there is a big chunk of work to be done around that. However, again, in fact, the birth of the ascetic movement is much earlier than the 4th century. And so I think you could do some interesting work with early Christian collectivities. One thing I wanted to include in this but didn't was Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Macrina. It's very interesting in terms of female collective governance. So Macrina and her mother, who are wealthy Roman women, Macrina talks her mother into basically setting up a female-led household with shared property, etc., which would be interesting to talk about that. And there are earlier precedents within the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which is usually seen as being 2nd century, although I think there are some question marks around that. But again, on her adventures around the Mediterranean, so Thecla is a young woman who hears Paul through her window preaching and becomes a Christian and runs away from her fiance, and then has adventures going around the Mediterranean, as almost an early Christian female missionary, with all sorts of liturgically interesting stuff happens. So she baptizes herself by throwing herself into a barrel of seals, all of this stuff. One of the things she does is she ends up living in what seems to be an all-female household run by a woman called Tryphaena. And so there are interesting examples of kind of proto-monastic communities there and thereabouts. They don't have a huge amount on we don't learn much about their governance for this earlier period. But for the later period, I think what you would say is that this tension, if it is a tension between democracy and hierarchy, continues in the sense that there is a real push towards communal identity and communal buy-in and involvement, but there is also between Pachomius and Shenouda and others, there is in some circles a real push on the authority of the abbot as well. Like this is a community that is the abbot's word goes. So I think probably you'd see the same thing, but that would be another interesting chunk of work to do. Thank you.
Yeah, Ben.
Thanks, James. That was really stimulating. It showed exactly why the Christian material belongs in this conference. The sort of older view would be that Christianity takes all these civic and democratic concepts and makes them into metaphors, which was also clear in lots of your text. But this is connected with what you want to say really that the metaphors are very vibrant, but also there's an accompanying real life democratic component to this. So in a way, it's almost as if there's also, it's not that democracy's disappeared, but there's a sort of overabundance of democracy. Christianity sort of competing with the cities and with associations to offer practical. You can choose at this point where you want to express pursue a democratic way of life.
I think so. I think I'm still definitely trying to figure out exactly where I'd sit on that spectrum. I mean, so the metaphors thing is definitely going on, and that's what we're finding in Paul and those early examples, which you could see were very kind of symbolic. As I said, I'd be a little bit hesitant about how much some of this stuff reflects practice. Although, for the later example, for Cyprian, for example, I think that probably has a pretty good sense of reflecting practice that's repeating on his own Federica. But what's interesting is even in the earlier material, if it is just kind of ideological, it's an ideology about practice, if you see what I mean, that it's not just the idea of the unity or equality of the community, it's the idea that everybody voted on the election of Judas's replacement, right? So the imagining of that equality is practically manifested, right? That they all cast the votes, right? It's the practical gesture of doing it. And again, in Origin or Hippolytus, it's not just a sort of imagined idea of it. It's the again, whether this relates back to or not, it's that everybody has to be in the room for this to be valid, right? Not that we all agree, but that the election of the bishop is not valid unless it happens in a place where everybody is there to give their assent, right? That we have to be together. So I think that's where my middle ground would be, that even if it doesn't reflect the same degree of Christian democratic practice on the ground, the idea is of an ideal practice. That would be my kind of splitting of the arrow.
I wonder if actually, in that case, the Hellenistic schools to some extent could help, which is obviously another thing that's feeding into this whole synthesis, but there too you have democratic concepts and institutions taken as metaphors, but at the same time, all of the philosophical schools had very complex collective life within the school itself, or within different philosophical associations and so on, so that this close connection between cosmic or metaphorical citizenship and actual collective practices is something which has a long history.
That's interesting, because the philosophical thing is also I didn't know that, which I didn't include it, but this is the other sort of thread that's running through this is the periodic and developing association of or attempt to write Christianity up as a philosophy, and it's kind of linked with the philosophical school. So famously Clement, the Alexandrian school is doing this, but in the West as well. So like Irenaeus, the way they write about heresy, Phil and I used to talk about this, the way the early Christians write about heresy is straight out of the philosophical playbook of how, of Diogenes Laertius et al. So if there is also a democratic discourse within the philosophical hierarchies, which I would like to know more about, then that could well be another source of influence.
I always have that instinct to think. Yeah, it's just a weakness of mine. It's a total weakness, but I just always have that instinct to think all this stuff is Hellenistic. And I didn't used to think that. I thought, well, things change with the Roman Empire, and things change with the Principate, and they change with the later developments of the Principate. But then I see the continued, recurrent, sticking power of what are basically Hellenistic topoi throughout all of this period, going well into late antiquity, and then things maybe change in the 4th century. But I mean, it's like the Hellenistic world lives from whatever we decided starts, 322, whatever day we decided starts, until well into the Christian era, and it's a late Christian era and ancient era. Yeah, but that's one of the reasons why we have these get-togethers, because we put together people who work on Hellenistic stuff, and then it's like, oh, actually, yeah, I didn't see that. This is all Hellenistic. Any other questions? Because I think we do have to keep attentive to time. Yeah.
If we have time.
Yeah, a quick one.
Yeah.
Because you have to give the.
No, maybe it's just a banal question, an observation out of my curiosity. I was really interested in the first passage of Eusebius when he talks about the polyarchia. So especially in relation to the term isotimia. So I was looking at the occurrences of this term, and we do not find this term in classical literary passages, except one occurrence in Xenophon, when he.
Why is Xenophon always funny? I don't understand it.
And he opposes the term isotimia to the term pleonexia. In relation to mercenaries and tyrants. So I was wondering if you have considered the concept of isotimia, and especially time, as maybe an ethical basis for these new Christian communities, considering also the importance of the term time and philotimia in the 5th and 4th century. We see Athenian democracy. So it was just out of my curiosity, because I also in another passage of Paul, there is a focus on the concept of time, talking about the body. Of course, in Christians, we do find a lot of time towards God, of course. But I'm talking about demand in social and ethical terms between the components of these groups.
Interesting. So that passage.
What's the first one? I think from Eusebius.
So this has been sort of claimed as one of the reasons for seeing Eusebius critiquing democracy, right? That it's sort of
monarchy versus polyarchy based on equality, that must be democracy. I don't think that's democracy. I think that's the tetrarchy. So the argument has been that when Eusebius is writing this in 337 probably, there's, well, it depends when you think it was published, but certainly in the 330s, maybe 335 for this, that there was no need to critique the tetrarchy, which is the other option, right? Of the rulers of 4 emperors together. So it must have been a broader critique, because the tetrarchy is sort of long dead. I think, to be honest, that that misunderstands the kind of way ancient rhetoric works. So I mean, the tetrarchy had not died much. So it takes Constantine a long time to sort of get rid of the other tetrarchs. So this is very much still within living memory, firstly. And secondly, if you look at other panegyrics from the period, they're very happy to critique emperors from 10 years, 20 years before, if it serves in the elevation of their subject. So there's no particular reason that there shouldn't be the tetrarchy. That makes me think, if that term polyarchy is not traditional, then in the Greek was, and that makes me think it's much more likely that multi-rule here refers to a sort of particularly imperial phenomenon of multi-rule of emperors, rather than it would seem that if that word is not traditional, it would seem an odd way to refer to democracy, and much more likely to refer to tetrarchy. Okay. I mean, in that passage, that it's interesting that you say, isotomia is is kind of how it relates to Christian virtues, because of course it's being critiqued here, right? This is the thing that Eusebius is saying is bad, right?
That depends on whether we translate the verb or the participle anti-parex agomene as based on. I don't know how we got based on out of that at all.
Yeah, that's
Drake's. And based on with ace is bizarre. So I would want a reinterpretation of what that word means. I can't do all the prefixes to figure out exactly what's going on, but it doesn't look like it's based on.
Yeah, with that anti. I mean,
opposite, beside, like out of, set, led. I mean, it's a weird word. I would want to check what that meaning is. And then ace is against isotomia.
Yes, that'd be interesting, because then he would be claiming that isotomia is what you get from monarchy.
Yes. Because the reason why someone might think polyarchia is democracy is because polykoirania is the word used in Homer to refer to the rule of many that Odysseus shoots down when Thersites comes along. So there may be, and Eusebius was extremely attentive to the classical precedents for his ways of thinking, as you know. But anyway.
And now you have a real conference.
Now a real conference. What does anti-parex mean?
That's my note to bow out. At that point, I'm done.
Shall we thank James? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just very brief closing remarks, and sorry for reading from my laptop for this final speech. Actually, it's more a stream of consciousness than a speech. But as you have seen, I've been writing my thoughts while handling multiple keyboards, laptop screens, like Dr. Octopus in Spider-Man. But mainly while listening to your stimulating papers, which have prompted me so many questions, given the serious modernity of the topics you have focused on. I know you now with your trains and flights, it's better not to their trusting too much on the UK public transport timings, so I'll be brief. So that
not anti-parex agomenos to be that on the public transport in the UK.
I'll be brief so that you have plenty of time to start your return after Durham. First of all, I want to start these closing remarks by thanking Phil for having included me in this adventurous project, and all the speakers, the chairs, and the participants in presence and online at this vibrant and challenging event that we were saying yesterday at the pub. I feel I've started organizing almost 1 year ago with precise targets, ideas, and objectives. The rest was just bureaucracy. It is the case to say maximum efforts, maximum results. It has been a great exchange of thoughts and opinions between friends and colleagues. Tuesday and Wednesday's weather has not been our philos. I still ask myself when Durham's weather can be a philos for our academic lives between teaching and research. But the atmosphere that we created through our questions, curiosity, explanations, doubts, and suggestions has turned up into a truly example of Greek-friendly and intellectual symposium. And I think that the goddess Athena has recognized that and granted us a surprisingly sunny Thursday and Friday, sparing us for not having used the owl. Therefore, I want to express again my sincere congratulations to your brilliant efforts, minds, skills, and expertises for having made this workshop a rich banquet from which anyone inside or outside their comfort zones, simply curious or deeply interested, could pick up something useful and inspiring. A controversial title, Phil rightly said. Is philosophy antithetical to democracy, he asked. We have had a lot of answers, arguments, and discussion in relation to this tough question. But since I am the last speaking, and since we have gradually come together from Athens to our modern times, I don't want to go backwards. I can only about summing up your detailed analysis, adding my own, maybe controversial as well, remarks, shortly focusing on our contemporary age. After all, we people of 2023 are living in democracies after Athens and still have the right or the duty to contribute to the discussion of the role and efficiency of democracy today. Personally, I've seen during these wonderful talks concrete links between the ancient times and our contemporary times. To demonstrate such a continuity, it will be sufficient to ask the same questions we have raised regarding the ancient Greek world and beyond to ourselves, people of our time, full of crises, weaknesses, and struggles. Just to start, don't we desire to hear praises of our nation, as Agnes has explained regarding the audiences of the new comedy? Aren't we in need of prostates, or prostatai, pragmaton, not Hellenikon, but Europaion? Aren't the promises of contemporary populists similar to the oaths of the Ethyrai? One might wonder if this new era, full of ideological uncertainty and anxiety, is not, as the case of Athens in 4th century BC, the beginning of an end. And what about the contemporary conflict between nature and governments? Is it not an evolution of the ancient physis versus nomos opposition? Like in the past, there should be today as well a unity of genres and minds producing deep and important concepts in relation to contemporary political matters, broadly meant in the ancient way, the matters related to our cities and our complicated social lives. Speaking of, James' detailed analysis through raising many challenging questions has showed the complexity of democracy, or better, democracies after Athens. A lot of his questions too can be applied to our times. Are our democracies ending or ended? What kind of democracies are there in our contemporary world? Should we measure the comparative strength of our democratic institutions? With Stefano, then, we have seen the ambiguous relationship between cynic philosophy and politics. I guess if we too are not rejecting the polis as early Greek cynics, in a certain way we are equally disappointed with our cities and their institutions and governments, but for sure we are not in the same privileged positions of the cynics, and most of all, we are not in the condition to praise and consider Penia as something good today. But aren't we in need of the sense of cosmopolitism? And following up on Ben's talk, aren't we looking for a synthesis of universalism, pluralisms, equality, self-expression, and individualism in our lives? And what about the role and especially the treatment of non-citizens and foreigners, namely contemporary immigrants, within these concepts and dynamics? Speaking of immigration, this biblical and historical phenomenon, let me say that we are quite different from the Greeks in this. who at least kindly labeled the immigrants with the word those who live with us, the metaphorical. On the one hand, Consuelo has openly shown how the ancient past can be used and misused to explain contemporary events, even forecasting the outcome of these same events in light of previous examples. Therefore, episodes and ideological notions which constantly return. On the other hand, Federica has impressively and meticulously demonstrated how and to what extent people are or have always been striving through time for more collective participation by forming communities on different scales and utilizing very different mechanisms with different scopes and impacts. Lastly, James has freshly taken into consideration early Christians and showed how tensions about and different sentiments towards democratic mechanisms did exist in their early communities. Common democratic tools were used, while new values, especially hierarchical, were set as the basis for these new, initially local and provincial groups, testifying thus the never-ending and necessary adaptation process of rising communities in relation to the problem of decision-making and participation. Thus, after this brief brainstorm summary played with anxious, pessimistic, and tragic transposition from antiquity to contemporaneity, what about democracy after Athens today? Looking at the futuristic picture from Benedetta Kappa Marinetti I personally chosen for the poster of our event, we may want to slightly modify the assertion of John Donne in his 1993 Western Political Theory in the Face of the Future, when he says that democracy is today the name of what we cannot have, yet cannot cease to want. So maybe democracy is today that motorboat that we cannot have, yet cannot cease to chase. But the true question today is, can we really reach democracy? And if so, again, what kind of democracy? As I said, during these dense 3 days, we have seen how many changes, attacks, discussions, shifts, and reforms democracy after Athens had undergone. And the fact that Phil and I did not invite on purpose only pure ancient historians has led us to a broad, comprehensive, and stimulating overview of the multifaceted questions and challenges regarding the evolution or involution, but better not to be so categorical, of democracy after the Athenian 5th century BC. Phil's main and ambitious target is to prove and explain that there is space for pro-democratic philosophy in antiquity. If it is not difficult to demonstrate this today, considering the constant presence of pro-democratic and liberal thinkers in political talk shows and debates, what about a space for pro-democratic thought among, let's say with no negative meaning, common people? On the one hand, the constantly decreasing flow in voting and the increasing preference for populist and autocratic parties, fortunately not everywhere, stands as an eloquent answer. On the other hand, the surge in demand of collective participation from below should be seriously considered as a dissatisfaction towards contemporary democratic dynamics at the institutional level. Nothing excessively new. These issues have emerged around the world and throughout history. Same questions and crises, but with different versions of democracy and especially Democrats. As contemporary Western politics demonstrates, many things have changed since Paul Cartledge words in 1999. Are we still sure that, as the scholars used to say, we are all Democrats now, are we not, ideologically speaking, regardless of our varying intellectual powers and the often fundamental local variation that we play on that theme? It is that regardless that today seems to be crumbling under the contemporary harmful nationalisms, tacitly full of authoritarianism, racism, chauvinism, and so on. I am not and do not want to argue that our governments are risking to be overthrown by tyrants or angry crowds, although the episode of Capitol Hill will be in our minds for a while. But if democracy has really changed after Athens, why cannot oligarchy and tyranny have new and sneaky ways and shapes? That modern democracy have failed and are still failing in many matters, especially in social matters regarding civic rights, hospitality, inclusion, education, green economy, cost of life, public health, and transports. I cannot carry on alone here the responsibility of stating that it is an objective truth, but the fact that it is a communist opinion is under our own eyes, if we are eager to keep them open wide and face such a dramatic state of the affairs. There are so many reasons and facts we should be taken into account for an in-depth analysis of the consumed relationship people-politics, that it is impossible and would be inappropriate to use this stage to go through them in detail. I do not want to be the Sophoclean Menelaus in the Ajax and pronounce a political tirade, but my personal remark on such a delicate topic is that the origin of the social-political problems of modern democracy may lie in their very difference with Athenian democracy in terms of participation and representation. As Carthage describes, we, the people, merely choose a small number of politicians to act politically for us. That merely choose has gradually led to serious problems of quality, trust, and reliability on both sides, elected and voters. However, under this light, nothing much has changed, perhaps, from the Athenian democracy, not the 5th century BC glorious one, but the 4th century sham, as PJ said, one. And perhaps again, PJ Rhodes regarding reading of 4th century BC Athenian democracy can be applied to our democracy as well. If democracy is to work, he said in 1980, there has to be not only democratic machinery, but also a demos which is eager to exercise its rights. But what kratos do contemporary demoi have to claim the exercise of their own rights? In other words, our contemporary democracies, I mean how they are run and organized, and which rights and benefits they are giving to us, and especially to minorities, still our comfort zones. This does not imply that we are to be labeled as post-ideological people, a term that today can be understood in quite negative terms as well, from merely pragmatists to far-right thinkers. Rather, as our event can prove, we are still attracted by ideology, its ups and downs, its features, changes, and shades through time, exactly because we want to shape and know something more about our own ideologies, their birth and aspects, and how they can be improved in terms of structure and principles. Especially, and at last, looking at the picture of our conference, ideology might rapidly assume different shapes after the passage of democracy. By the way, it is not a chance that I chose that picture, considering that it belongs to futurism, and it is from the wife of an artist, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, who did have some artistic connections with fascism in its very early stages. After all, the bond tyranny-democracy has always been tied since Pisistratus' time. Hence, feel free to interpret that motorboat either as the democratic ideology or the tyrannical ideology, leaving behind the form, namely to be interpreted, the crest of wave. But beware, my art, despite departing from reality, is never realist, used to say Benedetta Cappo Marinetti. Operating one last time a transposition of this formula to the present context, is this then the case, given the not encouraging situation of our societies today, to conclude, our democracies, despite starting from equality and inclusion, are never equal and inclusive? Thank you.
I just want to make sure to thank our supporters and sponsors. So the British Academy, who funded all of this, Durham University for providing a wonderful table and room, and for the Durham Center for Ancient Medieval Philosophy for keeping an eye to make sure that everything's in order over the time. I also want to make sure to thank more than by far more than anyone else, Andrea. Everything that works about this conference works because of Andrea's efforts, and everything that didn't work in this conference is the consequence of other people. Who shall remain nameless.
And thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Email to everybody about reimbursements. You just need to contact the ops admin, and they will help to take care of it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take food on the way or whatever if you need. Thanks for coming.
And an amazing conference.
It was great. I think it was were just, they were the right blend of like everybody came with a passion, but everybody could pull everything together. And that's something about quality combined and intellectual curiosity. Yeah, and curiosity. This is a group of people who are all curious, you know.
So it's always the best kind of conference, genuine debate.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. But thank you so much. Good to see you too. It was stimulating.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you for coming. Really, it's been a great pleasure. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we be in touch for the conference.